All right, so why don't we get to work? These will be the most boring lectures, I think, of the week. And that's a good conditioning statement, isn't it? Because by definition, you always want the next lectures to be better. Okay. When I say most boring, really, these will be the methodological lectures for the week. In other words, if you've looked at the slides, you'll see there's lots of algebra, not so much substance. What I want to do in these lectures is two things. First, I want to give you an overview of kind of where thinking is on intergenerational mobility. And then second, I will actually, and in a level of detail depending on time, work through some recent work that I've done, but putting it in the broader context of mobility. So in doing that, in essence, what I want to put on the table are three things. The first is simply that if we're going to talk about intergenerational mobility, we have to ask what it means to measure it. In other words, inequality, any dimension of inequality, necessarily, if we're going to do quantitative research, we have to translate the ideas we have, the substantive ideas, into a form that would allow for theorizing and for empirical work. So the first thing I want on the table are measurement issues. If we say a society is more or less mobile, what does that mean? We have intuitions for it, but at the end of the day, we have to somehow formalize that, because then we can actually make assessments and the like. The second thing I want to do is talk about different theoretical perspectives on mobility. And there, the point is not to say this explains mobility, but rather to say that the levels of mobility in a society are outcomes that are generated by a set of mechanisms, and we want to say something about what those mechanisms are. And then finally, I do want to make some comments about the normative implications of different theories and the like. All right, now mobility. So issue number one is how would we measure mobility? And I think the first thing to say, of course, is that there are many ways to measure intergenerational mobility. And what I want to focus on are the ways in which social scientists, and being a card-carrying member of the Economist Party, how economists in particular have measured mobility, but we want to recognize what the limits are to that. So what do I mean by limits? If I ask you the question, how would we think about intergenerational mobility, here's a very complicated way to think about it. I could say that I have a pair of parents, and those parents have life courses. In other words, as a parent, I have an income at age 22, 23, 24, all the way to the end point. Similarly, as a parent, I represent an educational level that my children will be exposed to that will evolve across time, a knowledge level the children will be exposed to that evolves across time. Those are just characteristics of parents. They're complicated. Furthermore, if I was going to ask about the effects of parents on children, I'd have to think about the behaviors of the parents. After all, you'd like to say that the influence of a parent on a child is not simply a matter of saying there's a thing called an income that mechanically maps into the income of the child, but there's the activities that you engage in. Do you read to your children? What sort of role model do you constitute? What sort of norms are created in the family, so on and so forth? All right. So in mathematical jargon, what that means is this is a high-dimensional system, a very complicated phenomena. In other words, there's this complicated life course for a parent. There's another life course for a child. And if I were to talk about mobility, I'd be relating the life course of the parent to the life course of the child, somehow saying one helps predict the other. All right, that's all well and good at a level of abstraction, but that's obviously far too complicated to think about measurement issues. I say all of this just because the important thing to keep in mind is that the mobility measures that are the focus of empirical social science are dimension reductions, they're simplifications, they're the compressing of these complicated things, life course of the parent, life course of the child, into manageable objects, and it's their interrelation that constitute empirical work. All right. And so the most common way to think about the relationship between the income, the socioeconomic status or life courses of parents and those of children is via a linear relationship and via this famous regression. And so the thought experiment is you take the logarithm of the income of a parent and you ask how predictive is that of the income of the child. And so the way you'd operationalize that is that it was to construct a regression. In other words, a linear projection of the child's income onto the parents through this model. So you'd say that the income of the offspring is some constant term multiplied by a coefficient rho plus rho times the income of the parent, and then the stuff that's left over. And so this rho here is called the intergenerational elasticity of income. And it's asking the question, if you raise the parent's income by 1%, what is the change in the expected log income of the offspring? Okay, so that's capturing something about the transmission process of income of parents to income to children. All right, and that's the object that's, I was going to say, launched 1,000 papers. In other words, measuring rho, constructing estimates of the intergenerational elasticity of income, the IGE, has been fundamental to the empirical analysis of mobility. Okay. There's many other things you could think about, but that's the most common one. To give one example, in sociology, traditionally sociologists do not even focus on income as the object of interest relating parents and children. In sociology, the traditional object of interest was occupation. In other words, what's the probability if somebody is, dare I say it, in an economics audience? Okay. In other words, you ask whether or not, what's the probability somebody has a blue-collar job, conditional on whether the relationship between the parents' class and the offspring class. That would be a traditional question. Or you could make it much more precise. What is the probability if your parents are doctors that you're going to be a doctor? So on and so forth. So sociology is typically, as I said, focused on occupations as opposed to income. Okay. Notice that this measure here is not asking questions about relative status. It's about the absolute relationship between parents and income. And I'll talk about that later, as we may not be interested in the absolute. We'd like to know where people live within the income distribution. So there's many senses in which you could say this is a delimited perspective on mobility, but nevertheless, it is one that has salience in thinking about how the world works. In other words, we ask the question, if somebody has a more affluent parent, how much does that predict changes in the incomes of the kids? All right. So if I was giving this lecture in 1979, as in before you were born, what number would be associated with the IGE? Well, the answer is that if one looked historically across, and so I wanted to mention something about China as well. So let me just say for the United States in 1979, the conventional number was around 0.2. So the idea would be that if you raised the parent's income by 1%, there was a 0.2% change in the offspring's income. Well, if you sort of think about that, that means that the expected change in the grandparent in the grandchild is 0.04. Do it another time. In 3 generations, the effect of a 1% change in the parent on the great-grandchild is really small. It's 0.008. And that led to an expression for the United States, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. So the idea, if you're a white collar, you're going to revert, blue collar, you revert, so on and so forth. It turns out that today, if you look at the United States, the estimates are much higher. In other words, rather than at 0.2, estimates tend to run as high as 0.6. There's some controversy about this, but I think that a fair reading of the literature is that what's happened, let's say a factual statement is measures of the IGE have increased over time, 0.2, then 0.3, then 0.45, as high as 0.6. And so the conventional estimates now are substantially higher. What I wanted to add here was an observation that if we look at China as an interesting counterexample, not counterexample, but cross-example, there the numbers for the IGE have moved from 0.3 to 0.44 in subsequent analyses of the data. Okay, so that's what I wanted on the background. Here's a number that makes, you can see some intuition for it. If you raise the parent's income, how does that affect your predictions about the child's income? That's the IGE. And then I put on the table an observation. If we look at the history of estimates for the United States, the estimates have increased across time over this, what I call this 40-year window. You see substantial increases in what the empirical literature tells us. I made a second observation, which is, oh, by the way, if we look at China, we also notice it's going up. Now, why did I put those 2 examples on the table? Well, the reason I want to put them on the table is the following. In the case of China, the interpretation is actually, at some level, is intuitive, and that is China's economy has undergone qualitative transformation, so it is no surprise that the relationship between parental income and offspring income has transformed. And then if you were to then think harder about the process of transformation, what it means to have privatization and the movement of some children from public enterprises, for example, to the private sector, et cetera, we could see reasons why we would think that the changes in this economic structure of China would have led to a greater persistence in socioeconomic status. What I want to, so that's one way to think about it. So what I wanted you to say on the table is, if you look at different countries and make these observations, that it appears that the estimates have gone up. And so in the case of China, the natural explanation we would give is to think about the relationship between the structure of the economy, the structure of the society, and the associated rate of intergenerational mobility. And of course, the IG really isn't mobility, it's persistence. But then I wanted to give you the less exciting thing. In the case of the United States, the explanation is not about structural change, it actually has to do with the details of measurement. All right, so what I mean by that is that if we ask the question, why have the estimates of mobility of the IG changed in the American case, even though there's some evidence that's increased in the last 30 years, the dominant explanations have to do with something that is not glamorous but fundamental, which is actually measuring things accurately. And so what I will now do is explain algebraically why it is that better data sets actually had a logical corollary that they would change the estimates of the IGE. All right, is everybody with me? So that's just a thing to have in the back of your heads, that we don't want to think about the IGE itself, the measure of mobility, as some physical constant in the universe, but rather it's the thing that's generated in the equilibrium description or determination of incomes of kids and parents. If structures change, we would expect that relationship to change. That's the kind of the first order issue in thinking about China. In contrast to the United States, which is unsurprising where most of the empirical work's done, it's going to have to do with the nuts and bolts of measurement. So, now why might that be true? Let's go back and think about the way that I started off the presentation. I said, well, if we were thinking conceptually about intergenerational mobility, intergenerational mobility is a description of the relationship between things about parents and things about kids. And so that there's some trajectory of characteristics, behaviors of a parent, and they influence a child. And we're particularly interested in understanding whether the socioeconomic status of the parent is transmitted to the child. Not in a deterministic fashion, but in a probabilistic fashion. All right? Now, from that perspective, I did something weird. I said there's a thing called the parent's income, and I said there's a thing called the child's income. And that's going to be what we have to focus on. In other words, the empirical literature on mobility is coming up with this one number called the IGE that relates something called the parent's income to the child's income. But if I said to me, what's a parent's income? That's not a well-posed object. Well, I have an income at age 40, I have an income at age 41, 42, but parents have trajectories of incomes. And that's the key point I want on the table, and that is that when people talk about things such as the relation between a parent's income and a child's income, or for that matter, a parent's occupation and a child's occupation, what they're doing is that they are compressing the trajectory of incomes or occupations to link the two up. So so that's what's going to be the first critical idea, is that when we think about the measure called parent's income, that's really the compression of that whole sequence of incomes. The second idea is we have to ask, what is it about parental income that we think is going to affect the child? So what do I mean by that? Suppose that I'm a doctor and I have a salary of $300,000 a year. All right. you would make a prediction for my children based on that fact, right? Suppose in contrast, okay, that's case number one. It's just a hypothetical. You take a doctor, I made up a number, big number, $300,000 a year. Okay? And I could ask, what's the consequence of having a parent who's a doctor who makes $300,000 a year, let's say at age 40? Here's a different question. I look at a child whose parent at age 40 wins a lottery for $300,000. They both have the same income. I'm assuming the parent had no other income. He just won the lottery that year. Would you make the same prediction for the child? No, of course not. Well, the simplest way to see that is that if I'm a doctor and I make $300,000 a year in 2018, you have a good prediction. I'm going to make a lot of money next year too. So in other words, when I measure the parent's income, and it's income from their human capital, from their skills, the measurement at one point in time is also a description of what the trajectory is going to be like. And so in contrast, if I win the lottery in 2018, presumably that doesn't make it any more likely I'm going to win the lottery in 2019. If it does, there should be an investigation. So what I've described for you is the distinction between permanent and transitory income. And so this is the key idea, which is that when I think about a parent's income in a given year T, I think of it as having two pieces. One part is, roughly speaking, the part we will ascribe to luck. So this is the fluctuations of things. Okay, it could be the luck of winning the lottery. It could be the luck that the University of Chicago has decided to give out bigger raises this year than otherwise. It could be the luck in real terms that inflation was high or low so that the real value changes. In other words, it's just fluctuations that we don't have any that we think of as random and uncorrelated. That's called transitory income. What's called permanent income would capture the idea that there's an aspect to my income in a given year that's persistent. It's, in the extreme case, permanent. Okay, everybody with me on that? And so that's going to be the first idea. And that is when we're measuring incomes of parents and children, we need to disentangle the transitory parts from the permanent parts. So you all agreed that there's a strong intuition that a parent with high permanent income has a different effect on the child than a parent who in 1 year has a high transitory income. You would also agree, I think, and if you don't, you should say so, I assert we would agree that we think that the ability of a parent to affect a child really has to do with the child's permanent income, not the child's transitory income. I cannot pass on to my children the ability to win lotteries. I cannot pass on to my children the good fortune of living in a low inflation environment so that the real income is not changing because of it, so on and so forth. In contrast, you might say to me that if my permanent income is derived from my education level, that I can influence the education level of my children, which in turn affects their permanent income. All right, so we have two ideas. In other words, one of them is measurement, and that is that when we look at incomes of people, what we're interested in, we have to think about the distinction between the transitory parts and the persistent or permanent parts. And the second idea, that really that if we were to unpack the effect of parental income on offspring income, we think of it as relating permanent incomes. Okay, and those are the two intuitions that explain the history of the empirical literature. All right, so what do I mean by that? Okay, first of all, everybody comfortable with this distinction, permanent income versus transitory? Notice it really goes back to the limits of constructing these simple measurements. If I look at the intergenerational elasticity of income, or I look at the correlation of income of parents and children, that's a huge simplification of the process that's linking parents to children. And so we have to ask how that simplification changes when we measure things differently. All right, so let's go back to my doctor's example. If I were to look at people who are doctors at age 40, they have extremely high incomes. Everybody with me? In contrast, if I look at doctors at age 23, what do we know about their incomes? They're very low. That's what it means to be an intern. Let me get them out of medical school. Let's say 26. So you're being paid very low income, and if you look at the hourly earnings, they're below the minimum wage because of the way that interns and residents are treated. So you agree with me if I were to look at 25-year-olds. Suppose I looked at parents at age 20, their incomes at age 25, and that would be very misleading about actually what the income is of the parent. And that's the point about this permanent transitory thing. And that's what I want to now say algebraically, how is it handled? Well, the answer is very simple. And that is the following. Okay, is everybody with me? We have this idea. I have a statistical relationship, income of the parent, income of the child. What I've argued is that the behavioral relationship is the permanent income of the parent and the permanent income of the child. So now we have, and this is the fundamental idea a fundamental idea in any empirical work. And that is that you have a theory, and that's what I'm putting down here. I'm saying the simplest theory would be there's a linear relationship between the permanent income of a parent and the permanent income of a child. That's a theoretical model. What I started off with was not a theoretical model, was it? It was a statistical model. I started off by saying, well, here's an empirical literature. It starts with a statistical relationship between the income of parents and the income of children. And so what I'm talking us through is the relationship between a theoretical model and a statistical model. Now, putting all these things together, what have I said in English? I've said that if I'm interested in the relationship between the incomes of parents and the incomes of children, and I think about what that means, the natural object of interest is to be interested in the relationship between the permanent income of the parent and the permanent income of the child. That's where the action is in intergenerational mobility. It's understanding how these features of the parents, their education level, their opportunities in labor markets, so on and so forth, are being transmitted across generations. To be blunt, we're not terribly interested in the correlations of winning the lottery across generations. Those are the uninteresting things. And so when we think about the relevant social science theory, that's the thing we want to do. We want to have the relationship between permanent income of the parent, permanent income of the child. That's the IGE we want is rho in this relationship. That's here. Please.
About how we don't consider the shock element of the income, because there are like some income, like if you're in certain hazardous occupation, in construction work, you're more exposed to risk of like losing a limb or something and therefore affecting your income. But then if you're a doctor, I don't think that happens as much. So there's something about like exposure to risk component, not just.
Okay, that's a very deep point, and frankly, it's deeper than the model that I've talked about. And so his question was, well, how do we think about risk and things like that? So there what you'd want to say is that, well, there's two ways to think about. One of them is I really have to think about the entire trajectory of incomes. All right. Then the question is, and so if I think about the trajectory, one question is whether the average is sufficient or does the volatility matter? All right. Now, one reason why volatility would matter is timing. So let's not worry about the risk in your sense, but think about two types of people. One, they have incomes that are going like this. Other people, the incomes go like this. And they ask, does the trajectory matter? Well, one reason it might matter is that if I'm 25 years old, I can't borrow money from a bank to engage in early childhood investment. And so the ideas that you're putting on the table are statements saying, we can't collapse the trajectories into single numbers. Okay, and so in some sense, even though we started off with that idea, I'm playing the game. I'm saying, suppose you can collapse it. Nevertheless, we get misleading answers. So the key point I'm trying to make is that if I look is the following, and that is that the behavioral relationship we're interested in sort of assessing the degree of mobility in a society is relating the permanent income of parents to the permanent income of the child. Okay, that's the simplest way to think about the linear relationship. You want a more sophisticated one, which is vector to vector, trajectory to trajectory. But what I want to sensitize everyone to is this distinction between the behavioral model and the statistical model. That's what econometrics is about. That's what empirical, identification problems are about in empirical work. It's relating the two. And so for our purposes, the way I want to talk about the mobility literature, just at this level, is our goal is the row that relates permanent income. But if you open up the Statistical Abstract of the United States, or you go to the Census Bureau, there's not a time series called permanent income. What we have are incomes. And the art or the science of doing empirical work is to translate the measures of actual incomes into measures of the things we care about, which are permanent income. And in fact, that's what's driven the literature, is just the creation of improved measures of permanent income. So, translating that into algebra. This is the statistical model. Yes?
I have a question. Although I got your point, but for me still it is, even if you consider permanent income mostly a statistical model, because of course parents pay for the education of their children, but much of it, which is captured by the permanent income, is just a proxy. For example, the networks, more parents with more income can provide for the children. So these kind of soft factors are captured in there, but it's not like the income itself which does that, right?
Oh, that's a fair statement. And so all I want to put on the table now is the measures that we use for intergenerational mobility are typically income measures. I want to see why that measure would change over time, and I want to give it an interpretation. I'm going to get to skills when I go to the theories. So in other words, when I made the statement, I relate the parent's income to the offspring's income, that's alighting exactly what the mechanisms are. Please.
You gave two examples of transitory income, the lottery and living in a country with high inflation. The parents can affect the behavior for kids to buy the lottery every year or to move into a country with high or low inflation.
Well, those are true, but if I were to, what I would say to you is you have to ask at the end, are these first order issues in the analysis? Okay, but and this is an important conceptual point, which is, and this is something you need to do when you read empirical work and when you do empirical work. If you use statistical models, those statistical models will have assumptions. Those assumptions, and this is kind of, again, what I'm going to call the learning to do good empirical work, the assumptions will be statistical assumptions. They will say things such as the regressors are uncorrelated with the error, so on and so forth. What you need to do, what's incumbent on you as a social scientist, is to assess those not as statistical objects, as behavioral objects. So if I said to you that, well, it's possible the parents self-select into countries with lower inflation rates, that's true. Obviously that's incontrovertible as a logical statement. Do I think that for the panel study of income dynamics in the United States, that that's something that I need to be worried about in interpreting the exercise? Okay, so it's not to dismiss your observation. It's to say that whenever we think about the behavioral assumptions that underlie the analysis, we have to make judgments about whether or not we can, as it were, live with them. Okay. There's no algorithm for that. In fact, I often, when I give econometrics lectures, one of my things I will do is I will say the scariest word. I'm going to write the scariest word in economics on the blackboard because I don't want to say it out loud, and that word is judgment. There aren't algorithms for these things. In other words, you have to make the judgments. Okay. Now, I put in the one on inflation over here because I think that one I could win the debate that that's not first order. A different one, which would be trickier, is about risky behavior. Okay, then I have to think harder about that one. Okay, good. All right, so what I want on the table now are just two equations. One equation says there's a behavioral relationship between permanent income of parents, permanent income of children. When we do empirical work, we don't have a thing called permanent income. We have to construct an empirical proxy for it. We construct empirical proxies for the income of the parents and the children. and we have to think about the relationship between that and the true model. And so here's the big point in the literature. Okay. And that is if the actual income equals permanent plus transitory, when I have a regression of income against income, that's a misspecified model. And what matters for us, and I know there's a sea of algebra here, is that the income of the descendant depends on the income of the parent, and the transitory income becomes part of the error in the regression. And this is the big point. If you take the statistical model, it's going to generate a thing called beta. That's the regression coefficient. That's the relationship between the income of the child and the income of the parent, however I measure permanent income. It will be biased. It will be smaller than the true relationship. The reason for that is what the regression is measuring is kind of how income is predicting income. But it's only permanent income that predicts permanent income. So think about, is everybody with me? So that creates a downward bias. Here's the intuition. If all of income were transitory, there'd be no relationship between the parents and the kids. If all income were permanent, then you'd get the true value. So the volatility of the income that's permanent versus the volatility of the income that is transitory controls the degree of bias. Okay, so lo and behold, just 2 lines of algebra, and that actually explains why there's a history of estimates of increased IGEs. What's happening is the data sets are getting longer over time. So if I average income across the life course, I'm averaging over more years. Well, the more averaging I do, what do I get if I keep averaging over and over again? Better estimates of permanent income. So that is not, the most scintillating, exciting, thing to say, but what has happened is the following, and that is that the way that permanent income is measured is just to take an average of incomes across a person's lifetime. Well, the more years you have, the better estimate you have of the part that's permanent versus the part that's transitory. Okay, does everyone see that? Okay. And so that actually explains the nature of the mobility literature. So the messages I wanted on the table are severalfold. Number one, that in thinking about empirical work, these calculations, you want to think about the relationship between the theoretical model you're interested in and the statistical model you're working with. Point number two is that in things like mobility, you can't get away from worrying very hard about measurement. Because at the end of the day, you're taking trajectories of the parents and you're compressing them into numbers, trajectories of the kids and you're compressing them into numbers. And it matters how long those trajectories are. And in this case, it turned out that you could actually explain, or at least understand, the evolution of a literature which was longer and longer data series on individuals, giving more accurate estimates. So you've probably heard about work by Raj Chetty, for example, that's using IRS data, or other work that uses Social Security data. The reason there's been changes in the estimates is people got access to data sets that had longer time series for the individuals. All right, everybody with me? Okay, so that's big idea number one. To understand where the mobility literature lives, much of the action has been trying to identify the relationship between permanent income of parents and kids, more accurate estimates of permanent income, provide more precise, provide less biased estimates of the IGE, and that's why they've been increasing. All right. So, everybody's comfortable with the intuition that that there's a relationship about kind of what drives the mobility literature in that sense. Because that's the first idea I want on the table. The second idea I want to have is to get some intuition. Is everybody with me? But, what's this IGE mean? How do we think about it? And so what I did was I rewrote the IgE equation, and notice there's a typo. That second y should be capitalized. I apologize. All I did was I took the relationship. I said that the permanent income of the child equals alpha plus rho times the permanent income of the parent plus a shock. I subtracted the parent's income from both sides. So in other words, the difference between the income of the parent and the permanent income of the child equals alpha plus rho minus 1 log parental income plus epsilon. Now, why did I do that? What is the left-hand side? What's the difference between the logarithm of the child's income and the logarithm of the parent's income? That's the growth in family income. If you have more than your parent, your family income has grown. If it's lower, it's gone down. And the change of the log is the percentage change, right? But my point's the following, and that is that if I write down this linear relationship, implicit in that is a relationship between the growth rate of income between parents and children and the income of the parents. Everybody with me on that? So, what's it mean if rho minus 1 is negative? It means that the higher the parent's income, the lower the growth rate in the family. If rho minus 1 were positive, it would say the higher the income of the parents, the higher the growth rate of the family. What determines whether rho minus 1 is positive or negative? It's whether rho is bigger than 1 or smaller than 1. Now, why would I make a big deal about this? If I'm thinking about inequality and mobility, and I'm thinking about family dynasties, okay, I could look at the inequality today, can't I? I could ask the question, do I think the inequality is going to grow between the descendants of the parents today, or is the inequality going to shrink? This regression speaks to that. What the regression says is that if rho is less than 1, I think that the inequality is going to shrink. But the only way inequality can shrink between the descendants of the rich and the poor is if the poor kids, the families that are poor have higher growth rates of income than those families that are rich. And so what I wanted you to see, in other words, you estimate something called an IgE. That's what tells us about persistence. But it actually speaks to a very specific question, which is convergence versus divergence. So when you observe contemporary inequalities amongst parents, this is now getting to real substance. Do I think about the configuration of society as one in which the contemporary inequalities will be, in expectation, diminishing across time? Or will the contemporary inequalities be increasing across time? And of course, the third possibility is that rho equals 1, and that would say that the expectation is whatever the inequality today will be the same as tomorrow. And so that tells you why there's actually a lot of importance to understanding the IgE, because it has to do with how I would predict changes in contemporary inequality. So this is a different perspective on the regression, but you can see it has a very powerful set of implications. Does that make sense to people? And if I make the statement that I observe contemporary inequalities in expectation will diminish, that's the same thing as saying in expectation I think the family income of the poorer family will grow faster, that will be greater than that of the higher income family. So embedded in this model are these strong statements about the forecasts about the persistence of contemporary inequalities. All right, so where does that leave us? I made the observation that in the case of the United States, the upper bound on estimates of the IgE of rho is about 0.6. So according to that model, if that's true, well, 0.6 minus 1 is minus 0.4. And so whatever the estimates are you look at in the American literature, they all have the same prediction, which is that contemporary inequalities will dissipate. How many people think that that's true? Well, as a mathematical statement, it's true. If I was going to tease you, I want to know how many people think that if we're going to do forecasts of Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates' offspring, that in some level of generations, they're going to have less income than mine. What a vote of no confidence in my children. I'm very hurt. All right, what's the serious point? The serious point is, I just gave you an example where you don't really believe that certain types of inequalities will diminish, even though I gave you, here's the fact, here's what the data say. How do I reconcile what the data are saying, quote unquote, with an intuition, which of course is correct, which is that if we were to look at the extreme upper tail, it seems strange to think that there's going to be this linear decline of the gap between the Bill Gates, the Bezos Gates family and mine over time in expectation. Okay. So why did I even bring this up? Yes?
Maybe because there is a difference. You said that we were studying absolute inequality instead of relative inequality, right? So that is the issue that explains that gap.
I think that's one candidate, but I hope that's the one, but I think it's the other, that they're probably going to stay. It's not, that gap's not going in absolute value to zero. The point I wanted, okay, the reason I brought that up to motivate is that this is a linear model. This model says that the relationship between parent and offspring income is the same if you're desperately poor as if you just happen to have $150 billion in wealth. So these very striking implications that if you were to forecast the income differences between my descendants and those affluent individuals' descendants, that should be diminishing in expectation. And at 0.6, if you think about it, that's a pretty big change. In 3 generations, it says that 80% of the gap will disappear. I was laughing, as I said, I don't think anybody intuitively thinks that's going to happen. I wish it would happen. Well, in terms of one side going up, the other side going down doesn't do any good. But there's an intuition that tells us that seems like a strange prediction. I want you to see why it's a strange prediction. It's because it assumed a linear relationship between the incomes of the parents and the incomes of the children. You all learned when you started doing statistics and econometrics, what were the models that you initially worked with? I presume they were linear models. If you average something, that's just a linear model. This is a constant term. I want you to see that the choice of these types of functional forms is very powerful in terms of how it makes you think about the world. And this is back to the questions that was being asked over here. If you say to me, this is the behavioral model is a linear relationship, that entails very strong things about long-run inequality patterns. And so I want to emphasize that that's part of what you want to be doing as empirical researchers, is again thinking through the implications. I know it's kind of a broken record, but it's just, you have to ask what the behavioral implications are of the statistical assumptions. Okay, and so in the context of intergenerational mobility analysis, the very act of writing down the linear model entails restrictions on the types of persistent inequality, intergenerational inequality, that the data can reveal, or that we can think about via the data. So that's the first point, okay? In other words, is everybody comfortable with the argument I'm trying to make here? That there's a kind of a thing we have to recognize. Linear models don't allow us to think about certain things. In particular, let me make this concrete, there's no poverty trap in this. If you believe there are poverty traps in the world, this is the wrong model to look at the world. It doesn't admit them. They don't exist here. Now, with my co-authors Andrews Cortellos and Ximing Tan, we claim there's another thing to look for. We call them affluence traps. In other words, it's one thing to say that if you're very poor, it's very unlikely your kids can get out of poverty. A different thing to say is if you're really affluent, it's very unlikely your kids will not be affluent. Those are all nonlinearities. Those are missing from the data. That's the first thing I want on the table, and something you need to think about when you do empirical work. If you said, I'm interested in intergenerational mobility because I care about poverty traps, this is the wrong framework. Because you won't be able to see them. That's point number one. Point number two, notice that when I talked about this regression, this relationship between parents and children, what did I say we care about? I said we cared about rho, the intergenerational elasticity of income between parents and children. What did I ignore? Alpha. Maybe we care about alpha too. Let's think about China and alpha. I made the observation that in Chinese data, there's been an increase in rho. It's gone from 0.3 to 0.44. Is that by itself an interesting fact? Well, I suppose it's interesting, but it's a misleading fact because something else happened. The growth rate, that's alpha, went from 5% to 10%. So if I'm going to talk about mobility in China, it's a strange thing to say I only care about the correlatedness of the parent and the child when I ignore the fact that the growth rate for everybody jumped. And so that's a second message I want on the table is in thinking about intergenerational mobility, we have to not just think about the link between the parent and the child, we have to think about what's going on in the society as a whole. And so that doesn't really apply to the United States because you don't have these qualitative change. Well, we would like to have them to move the growth rate to 10%, but that's not happening. In other words, in an economy in transition, a society in transition, you can have these dramatic changes in growth, and to sort of talk about mobility or persistence without accounting for the changes, these other changes, is misleading. All right, any questions on that? So the messages I wanted you to take from this equation and my description are the following. Number one, this equation is a very precise way to think about the world. If I were to use this and say this is how I think about the world, it doesn't let me think about poverty traps or affluence traps. Those are nonlinear phenomena. And so one wants to be aware that it is not the case if those are your objects of interest that this is the right way to analyze data. You have to have a nonlinear model. The second observation I wanted to make is that in writing down these representations, they treat one of the parameters of the relationship as sufficient for thinking about mobility. In some cases, that might not make sense. I gave you one example, which was the case of China. And that is that if we're thinking about the changes in intergenerational transmission, we can't ignore the fact that this economy has exhibited historically by any standards in the world unprecedented rates of growth. Everybody with me on that? Here's a completely different example. If I was interested in black-white inequality, would this be a useful regression for me? Well, it's the only sense in which this regression can speak to black-white racial inequality in America, the fundamental dimension of inequality, is by saying that the reason that the children of African Americans have lower expected incomes than the children of white parents is because, of the children of white parents is because the parents have different incomes. If I thought that there's other reasons, such as discrimination, why there are gaps, this model doesn't have them in there. In other words, in this model, what I would be interested in if I wanted to talk about racial inequality is not rho, it's alpha. I'd want to know something about the steady states of African American dynasties versus Caucasian dynasties, and that would be something having to do with alpha. And so again, looking at the world through this model by itself doesn't let us answer certain questions. It doesn't mean the model's uninteresting. It doesn't mean these aren't good summary statistics about how mobility works in America. But there are limits, there are going to be dimensions. They don't speak to things we're interested in. We are often interested in what I called the nonlinear parts. The top, think of the 1% versus poverty traps. Another thing we are often interested in is group level inequality. We're not just interested in the family dynasties as isolates. We're interested in parts of the population that have been historically and contemporaneously disadvantaged. And that leads to different questions. Right. And this is where a lot of the action is in the literature. And so I just want to put that on the table as things to think about. All right. So what I go through in the slides, and I'm going to skip all of these, is a demonstration of the following. Okay. If the world is really nonlinear and there are poverty traps and affluence traps, even if that's true and I look at the world through a linear model, I might find a negative relationship between initial income and family growth. Or even though there are poverty traps, everybody with me? When I ran my intergenerational mobility regression, I get a coefficient less than 1. And so the reason I go through the algebra, which is not worth going through in the lecture, is to say that if the world is nonlinear and I look at it through a linear prism, it can be extremely misleading. That doesn't mean that linear models are useless or uninteresting. It means that they are good for summary statistics and for answering certain questions about average tendencies. And so I'll leave you to go through the lecture notes on the algebra, but the message is if you are interested in looking for poverty traps, you have to have a statistical model in which poverty traps are explicitly part of the model. Otherwise, they may remain hidden. Okay. So what I want to emphasize, and this is where I want to finish because I'm going way too slow, where I want to finish is to make the observation that I've talked entirely about absolute mobility measures. And in fact, where there's kind of, this work by Raj Chetty that's received much attention is actually about relative mobility. So the way that literature works is that it, and there's a typo there that should not be a log, I'm sorry, is it takes, what you do is you look at you take the income distribution and you find the rank of the parent, and then you see the relationship between the rank of the parent in income distribution and the rank of the child. And what they find is, he and co-authors argues there's a linear relationship between those. Notice that it's asking a somewhat different question. Think about it this way. I could have, let's take the Jeff Bezos versus me. All right. It could be the case that over time the gap between my descendants and his is getting smaller and smaller, but they're always ahead of me. So even though you could have a row less than 1, by the rank order statement, the ranks never change. Okay. Now, there's reasons to care about relative mobility as well as absolute mobility. I don't want to take a stance on one being correct, nor could I. In other words, it depends on what the normative considerations are. But I want you to be aware there is a different way to think about comparing parents and kids, and it has to do with where they are relatively speaking, and the simplest way to do that is just with ranks. All right, so that's all I wanted to say about measurement. So I want to emphasize, got to decide what it is you want to measure about the parents and the kids. That's the permanent income issue. The second thing is you have to think about what a linear model tells you. And the third thing you need to think about is whether you care about absolute versus relative mobility. And the C of algebra in the slides, which I hopefully skip most of it mercifully, is simply ways of instantiating those three ideas. All right, so everybody already knew this. There's substantial predictive power from parents to kids. If I know things about parents, that tells me something about the kids. And so what I want to do is ask the why question. What are the mechanisms that would relate the two? Please.
Since you framed your lecture as intergenerational
Yes.
mobility, is one of your hypotheses just that mobility is a factor on that piece of how strong the correlation is with the...
Yes, so mobility is this very big concept. The measurement says that one of the ways to characterize mobility is how much does a change in parental income translate into child income, and that's the intergenerational elasticity of income.
Mm-hmm. So the mobility is just how much that shifts, not necessarily whether so for me, just sociologically and with studying bilingual education, I'm interested in how, it would be more questions like, how is a migrant worker not passing on his trade? So that kind of mobility, actually, he loses all the momentum that he's gained from gaining
Yes.
social capital and professional capital, even if it's something like migrant farming,
Mm-hmm.
which is not lucrative. He lost all that because of the second generation's desire
Yes.
to be
Okay.
mobile. And so then there's a loss in the mobility, whereas almost a certain kind of statisticity where you studied also what I did, and I watched some Asian tea ceremonies at Yale, which 17th generation, I was thinking that just doesn't happen in America anymore, right? So I think that for me, questions of mobility, and I could talk to you after class, but I think that the questions of mobility are also just when things are passed down, and that correlation being stronger, because you get to pass that down instead of what most Americans do, which is start a new business, start something different from my father, start something different from my grandfather, get into a different business.
So I think.
Is that not? But that's not what your research is, right? Is that
Well, I think that those are dimensions of richness that I don't think that are conventionally studied in the literature. And what I mean by that is that if I say, okay, so the economist thing is, well, we cared about the income of the parents, the income of the child.
And it's very quantifiable.
Yes, and so whatever that is, that's their relationship is how we think about mobility. A different question you could ask is cultural. In other words, the parents have a set of values. I could ask how persistent those are. Do parents pass those things on to their how likely is those things get passed on? And so the tea ceremony would be an example that is completely non-economic. I mean, it has little to do with whatever the economic theories are. That's a cultural idea. A third idea you put on the table is more complicated with reference to thinking about occupations. And so, to my ears, I heard two things. One of them would be that in thinking about the process by which things about the parents translate into things about the kids, the parents could have skills that actually, because the society is mobile, they disappear. So in other words, if I'm a farmer and I have skill, I have knowledge associated with farming, if what I did was I sent my kids to a college to become accountants, all of that knowledge ends. And so you have that's consistent with upward mobility of incomes. What you wanted to say is that there's a bigger vector of things about the parent, and some of that stuff actually disappears. And so I'll put that's yet another dimension. These are going to be very focused on income. Yeah. And so when I say theory, what I want to ask is this narrower question, which is that I put on the table ways to think about the statistical relationships between measures of parents and measures of kids. The message you'll get over and over is, yes, they're correlated. And furthermore, those correlations seem to be mediated by things such as location, et cetera. And so that's going to lead to the next thing is what are the conventional theories that have been proposed for understanding the relationship between parental income and child income. All right, and so I guess what I want to say, again, I'm going to put down 4 candidate explanations. I want to be clear that, number one, they are not exhaustive of what social science has to say, that I assure you. And second, they're all logically compatible. In other words, there's no sense in which you could ask a question about the relative empirical salience. That is not a statement that they're actually, in any sense, competitive. In other words, the way that I've with my co-author Buzz Brock, we've said that we would describe intergenerational mobility models as open-ended theory. What I mean by that is if you have a theory that it's this, that doesn't mean my theory is wrong. In other words, the theories are all logically compatible. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right. So how are theories constructed for intergenerational mobility? I guess the first comment I want to make, and I'm going to put 4 theories on the table. Okay. The first theory are going to be the neoclassical models of intergenerational mobility. Those are models that emphasize the way human capital is formed. So the thought experiment is the parents have an income. That income determines the education of the children. Education of the children determines human capital for the child as an adult, and that determines future income. That's going to be a theory. A second theory, which it's a distinct theory, even though it obviously will have family resemblances, is a theory of skills. What that says is that the interactions of parents and children produce skills in the process of development, those skills translate into labor market outcomes. The third theory I'm going to put on the table are social theories. What they're going to say in essence is that what parents do is they affect the social environments in which children develop, and the social norms, the social networks, the public goods, all of that transmit parental economic status to offspring. And the final thing is I want to make some comments about genetics. In other words, that if we think that genotype matter, you know, the stuff you're born with, so to speak, then that in and of itself would explain why there's some persistence. So if I asked, you know, if somebody's, you know, the conditional probability somebody is a good violinist is higher if their parents are good violinists. One reason you would give for that is that there's some genetic component to the skill of playing violins. Okay? And that's part of what you need to think about when you talk about mobility. These are all these different factors. I will not talk about political economy, which is yet another factor. I mean, there's lots of different ways that you could think about this, but I just want to put 4 explanations on the table. Okay. Please.
Just real quick, so income skills, social environment, genetics, how do you define skills?
That's a hard question. And so skills will be thought about as having 2 types. They'll be called cognitive skills. And here's a term that psychologists get mad at economists for, non-cognitive skills. Now, psychologists get mad because everything is, if it's the brain, it's cognition. The new term of art is social and personality skills. Okay. And so the key distinction is that there's a much richer set of attributes that matter for labor markets. Please. I'm sorry,
Large check his work focuses on the geography of inequality, like he has these heat maps, and
Yes.
shows like some places are more unequal,
Yes.
mobility is much lower than other places. How is that? So
that's going to be social in my world. So in other words, the location matters, and there's going to be something going on at the location. Okay. All right. So within the body of what I'm calling of economic theory, there's a set of classical models of intergenerational mobility, and I'm going to call these family investment models. And they are due to Glenn Lowry and Gary Becker and Nigel Tomes. When I say that these are classic models, they have very basic economic logic built into them, but they would explain why there's mobility. The logic is very, as I said, it's very basic, but the issue is how do you instantiate that formally and work everything out and show it's logically coherent. That, by the way, is something I should make a comment about, which is why write down mathematical models? After all, and part of what I'm going to emphasize, and I'm trying to emphasize in the lectures, is this is what the models mean. You could then ask, well, why did I have to write the math down? Why don't you just say this is what the models mean? Well, there's several reasons for that. And this is important to keep in mind. The first one is, what models do is they make sure that the different ideas logically cohere. In other words, that it's one thing to sort of say, I have these ideas about how people behave, but I have to ask, does it all add up? And one thing that the formal models do is they give you a template to see what the logical relationships are. Okay? The second reason that it's valuable is that what models allow us to do is move from descriptions of individuals to equilibrium descriptions. What do I mean by that? I could have, the intuitions we have often are what motivates people to do things, but then the question is what happens collectively? That's not something you can reason out verbally often. You need the mathematics for that. The third reason to do it is that it provides a segue between theory and empirical work. When we formalize our ideas in the theoretical context, we can then ask what would be the statistical analog to that, and then see the relationship between theory and empirics. Okay. All right. So what I want to say is that these models have extremely simple intuitions in them, and they're going to provide a theory of persistent inequality. Basically, the idea is going to be that now notice, this is, I'm going to say it's an American thing, and I'll explain what I mean by that. The key thing parents do for their children is they educate them. They create human capital. So this is a world in which human capital is the segue to economic success or failure. When I said these are an American thing, the tradition in continental Europe a long time ago would be to focus on inheritance. It's a different theory to say that the reason that what happens is parents leave stuff to their kids. That would be, and so if I were to write down a model of intergenerational mobility for Britain in 1780, probably land is pretty important. You'd have to have a different, you wouldn't focus on human capital or skills, you'd focus on the transmission of things like land. Okay, so this is a very specific to one type of phenomenon. Okay. So, the way that, okay, and now I want you to sort of see now the logic, so how do you actually construct a formal economic model? It's really very simple in this context. What you do is you have to first of all take a stance on kind of describing the environment. And so the way you would do it is you would think about individuals in what are called overlapping generations. And the way that you proceed is to say that I look at a family dynasty. At each point in time, there's a parent and a child. And so in the dynasty, each individual is simplified to have two periods of life, childhood and adulthood. All right. And so what happens is I'm a child, I receive human capital, I grow up, I have a child, I invest in human capital. The next period, my child becomes an adult, invest in her child, so on and so forth. All right? So that's it. It's a very simple vision of the demography of the society. Okay. There's a bunch of stuff in there you could say is crazy. One of them is that the reproduction doesn't take two. In other words, it's asexual. There's these isolated dynasties. Okay. That's an example of what I'll call the art of doing formal theory. That's the sort of simplification which obviously as an assumption is ridiculous, but for the purpose of the model, it's a great assumption because it lets you make progress. Because if I had to account for the patterns of marriage and who marries who, and the number of kids, so on and so forth, all of that would add complications that would hide the underlying economic logic. Okay, and so maybe that's another didactic message I want to put on the table, which is in empirical work, you have to, first of all, assess the statistical assumptions as behavioral assumptions. Second, you have to make judgments on when the assumptions are first-order impediments to inference. Similarly, in doing formal theory, you have to make judgments about which assumptions, even if they in isolation are silly, actually are facilitating to understand the model. Okay. All right. So in the simplest environment, as I say, it's very simple. So what happens is that in the first period of life, childhood, children are very passive. They don't make any decisions. They just receive something. The thing they receive is education. And so each family is going to make some choice of education that their children receive. Okay. Now the way that education works, and this is important in thinking about the logic of the model, is the education that I receive as a child is going to depend on two things. It depends on the investment my parents make, and it depends on luck. Call that zeta. For those of you that aren't economists, you know economists love Greek symbols. All right, so that's a zeta. And so one idea there would be that if my parents make an investment in me, my ability matters. So so the actual effect on my education is the interplay of the investment and this latent thing, this luck, in this case called the genetic lottery, to quote John Rawls. All right, it's a very simple idea, isn't it? All right. The second idea is going to be the following, and that is, notice how simple, again, very simple. If you know the education of a person combined with their luck in the labor market determines how much income they get. And so the algebra would say that the income of the parent, of the adult, is determined by the investment they received in childhood and their labor market luck. And labor market luck is epsilon here. All right, so my education is dependent on my parents' investment and my luck in childhood. What happens to me in adulthood depends on the education I have, the human capital, as it were, and then the labor market luck. So 2 sources of luck. All right. Now, if I think about what I've described as I have a production function, actually I've described the technology of the economy. I said there's some process by which education is produced. And I've said there's some process by income is produced. So where's the behavior? Who's doing what? Okay. This is now the thought experiment, and that is you have parents who have incomes, and those incomes are going to be divided into 2 pieces. One of them is going to be consumption, the other is going to be investment. So now we have you can see what the theory is going to say. It's going to say parents have a claim on resources defined as income. Parents make investment decisions based on that income. And hence the parent's income determines the investment, determines the child's income. And that's a theory of inequality. Now, that sounds very elementary, doesn't it? It says that the income of the parent determines the budget set. It's in the budget set that the parents make choices, including how much to invest in their kids. Please.
Do the parents receive something from the child because they have to divide their income from some
Okay.
and investment? But thinking as a economist,
So
they have to gain something.
Well, I'm scandalized that you've asked the question. She's asked, why would parents invest in their children? Well, so let me say that in this model, what you've said is I left something out, which I haven't told you what the utility function, the preferences of the parents. Right. Obviously, there's many motivations for parents making investments in their children. I was laughing because the obvious one is that thing called 1,000,000 years of evolution locks something in the brain. Okay. And so in these models, the typical assumption is the parents care about the kids. In other words, there's a form of altruism. Though I think if you have kids, you know that it's not really altruism. It actually makes you happy. Okay. But you brought up, okay, that's the museum. The serious point is in more complicated models, you would also think about the relationship between the parents and the kids in terms of investments and subsequent obligations. So a canonical argument about poorer societies is that children take care of the parents, and so the investments in the children are partially a form of, as it were, a privatized social security, a family-specific social security system. That's not part of this environment. It basically says, I care about my kids, I do something. Please.
So the other kind of this determinant that we're saying in some ways income actually determines the knowledge where to invest. So if you have more money, you know where to invest. With less money, you don't know where to invest. Because if we're saying your investment in everything is based upon your income, you must have some knowledge of where to invest.
Okay, so then I didn't use language well. The only investment here is in your child's education. I just decide how good an education to provide them. Okay. Now, but you brought up a much more complicated thing, which is a part of what might matter is the investments, not in my child, but in my portfolio.
Yeah, or I'm just thinking
Yeah.
you might have grown up in a society where education for women looks very, very different from
Okay.
education for men. But that's what even if you're wealthy, that's what you know is where you're supposed to
Yes,
invest.
okay. I think that this is not a good model for that phenomenon. And let me explain what I mean by that. Well, in a trivial sense, it's not, because there is no gender in the model. And so then the question is, suppose I had a model with gender, where would I want to instantiate these ideas? One of them, to be blunt, would be to say that the value I put on the education of daughters is different than sons. That would be a description possibly of preferences. Okay, I could just make that a primitive. I think that but that doesn't sound entirely satisfactory. I would probably in that model need to think harder about how would I formulate social norms. Okay, yet another, and so then we would have to play the model out that way. And so I'm glad you brought this question because, we've sort of said how to think about formal economic models. The cheap comment to make, they're never true. But why do you do them? It's to provide understanding of phenomena. The purpose of this model is to understand why parental income would influence offspring income. The economic logic is very specific. It says the income of the parents is a constraint on the capacity to create human capital in children. It is not a model that is, as I've written it, that's designed to explain differential treatment of children, let alone differential treatment of classes of individuals. Okay. And so it provides, as I said, I want to say it provides understanding along certain dimensions. It has a lack of understanding on other dimensions. So this is the budget constraint, and then that's something, but that sounds, if I said here's an introductory economics textbook, here's your income, you either spend it on your kids or you spend it on consumption, you'd say that all sounds well and good. But what I want you to see is there's actually a very important assumption there. That's not a triviality. Why do I say that? You could say, well, budget constraints are always, that's trivial. Of course, you have a budget constraint. The question is, why is there an intergenerational budget constraint? In other words, why can't I do this? Why can't I go to a bank and say, lend me $10,000, I'm going to invest it in my child, and when my child grows up, they're going to pay you back? After all, shouldn't I do that? If I have no income and my child has incredibly high ability and is going to be really productive, that sounds like a high return loan. The answer to that question is about how many people here drive Mercedes-Benzes? Okay. I'm shocked. If you think about it for a second, think about your lifetime budget. You drive a Mercedes-Benz? Sorry? Do you drive a Mercedes? I want to know how many people here. Oh, well, back to Mercedes. All right, so here, okay, so I want to know if I looked at your lifetime income streams, you're going to think about technical, you're going to make a lot of money in life. Why aren't you borrowing against your future income and living much better than you sad, tough master's students typically do? You know the answer to it, which is a bank will not give you a loan. All right, so I certainly will not. All right, and I'm not a bank. Okay, the serious point is, and this is what I want you to see, is the behavioral stuff in the model. And why a budget constraint you have to think hard about. And that is, the model has a very simple assumption, which is parents cannot entail their children to pay debts. And so that rules out certain types of loans existing. And of course, legally, you can't entail your children to pay debts. Okay. When I asked you the question about banks, and you buying the Mercedes-Benz next week, that's called moral hazard. In other words, what I should have done, if I could have done it in graduate school, I would buy the Mercedes-Benz and then I would default on the loan. And now the serious point is that without commitment, certain types of intertemporal decisions are not going to exist. And here the key intertemporal decision is that family income is constraining on offspring investment. Okay. That's the economics. That's all the actions there. Now, obviously, in the real world, there are many types of loan programs. But notice that that would require in having a much more complicated model where we differentiate periods of life. And so one would distinguish between college loans and loans for early childhood investment. One of them exists, one of them doesn't. Okay. But what's driving this model is that parental income is constraining on the opportunity, the ability of parents to invest in their children. All right, that's it. That's the whole model. All right, so the way the world works is the following. Okay. Let's assume, just for simplicity, that I know my child's ability. You raise a kid, you know something about them. I'm going to make some investment in them. It's going to be determined by their ability and my income. That's the relationship. Notice I didn't say anything about preferences. Whatever my preferences are, the two things that determine my decision are the ability of my child and the constraint I face, my income. Okay, there's some algebra. I just wrote it down. Well, that means that there's a relationship between my income and my child's income, and what it does is you take my income and my child's ability. That tells you the investment I make. You take the investment I make and my child's ability, that tells me their education. You take their education and their labor market luck, that tells you what their income is. So all you do is you keep recursively substituting all that annoying algebra, and lo and behold, that is the model. Okay. Now, is that model beautiful? No, it's simple. The only comment I want to make here is, you notice how few assumptions I needed? All I need to say is people face budget constraints, and the budget constraints determine stuff that matters for the kid's income. What the logic of the model does is put it all together. Okay, so this is the basis of classical models of intergenerational mobility. Please.
Would it be possible to perhaps include a simple taxation model, like there's a minus T or something that sometimes money goes away from the rich?
Oh yes, absolutely. And so what you would have, so the way you would, okay, so in fact you can look at Lowry's paper for that. So what he will do, you can introduce taxes that are then used to subsidize education. So that's how you would proceed. You would simply build those things in. But notice the logic of the model is perfectly compatible with that. Now, that is not a beautiful model, but it's also not a linear model. And so this is what, again, in the slides you will see, and this is a message I want to say, is even the simplest models of intergenerational mobility don't produce this regression that's the empirical work. Now, if I choose F, E, and G correctly, I could make the model linear. And so in the slides, I will go through the algebra of what are the assumptions about preferences for parents, the assumptions for the production of education, of human capital, and the relation between human capital and income, such that if they all hold, then there's a linear relationship. But that'll be a special case. All right. That's a theory of inequality. And that of mobility. All right. So what's going to be critical there, just to repeat, please.
Could you argue that there's a model in which you don't really consider a child's ability? Because I can picture a sense of, as a parent, you don't realize your child's ability maybe because they're so young, but because I have the money, I can invest in their education, be in a better school, to kind of explore potential abilities. So you don't necessarily include that in your...
Okay, that's a very interesting comment. So I'm going to unpack it into some pieces. So the way that I talk, like I said, I know the child's ability, and based on that, that affects my investment. Notice that I didn't say whether it increases it or decreases it. In other words, one thing I could say is, well, if my child has high ability, every dollar has more bang for buck. Or, but it may be the opposite. In other words, it may be that the investments, it doesn't matter, they'll do well anyways. The second thing to notice is that the way that I decide to invest in my children based on their ability isn't just about the effect of ability on the productivity of the investment, it's something else. It's what do I care about? So if I have so suppose I had two children, one has high ability and one has low ability. One thing I might do is invest more in the child with low ability because I want them to both have equal incomes. I'm concerned about the equality of their incomes in adulthood. So one of the answers to your question is we have to sort of unpack the reasons why my child ability affects my decisions are actually twofold. One is it affects the productivity of the investments. I can go either way. Second, because and this is where the preferences come in, if my goal is to maximize the sum of my children's utility, I would want to account for the ability differential in those investments. Now, then you ask, so that's one piece of it. The second piece is, how would I unpack the model? In other words, I was making the assumption that the child's born and the doctor said, what is his or her name? And they told me, and they said, fine, here's their DNA. Here's the genome, we sequenced it for you. In fact, what you would want to say is that the parent has some knowledge of that, and maybe part of this untelescoped version of the process is that the part of what a parent does is learn what the skills are for the child. And that would be a different way to think about investments at different points in time. The question you brought up is related to stuff that was brought up over here about early childhood investment in non-cognitive skills, and that's why I call it the second model, the skills model. is these perspectives are very income driven and they collapse childhood into this thing called T. What you want is to unravel it and to say there's a trajectory of things in childhood, and a component of that is the revelation of who the child is. But that's a much richer model than this one. Please.
What the preferences in sort of conventions, because it's like my income sort of influences how I think about what I care for. Perhaps because I have a higher income, have higher education, I value education more, so I have higher beta for investment.
All right, now that's a very hard question. The question was about the endogeneity of preferences. So I'll say, kind of standard operating procedure in an economic model is you write down, say, this is preferences, this is constraints, technology, and this is how beliefs are formed, and from that you adduce how people behave. What you want is, when I write down a model of the preferences, is to have some theory as to what determines them. The models that I've described here, everybody has the same utility function. Now, one way I could go about describing that is I could say that the utility I receive from my child's income depends on my education. So this is what I mean. Okay, I could say there's a piece of my utility. It depends on what my child's education is. What you want is this. In other words, the valuation I place on my child's education is either, well, maybe it's increasing, maybe it's decreasing. Whatever it is, it also depends on the other. That's very consistent with that would not affect the logic of the model the way I've set it up in a fundamental way. Please.
In previous years, you had a session here in the summer school on identity economics. So
Yes.
one interesting idea is that you can sort of get those preferences into the identity function of the parent.
So the phrase identity economics, just so you understand, I don't make sure everybody has the same language, is, I'll say, standard ways to write down utility functions is to say there's stuff that I get utility from consumption. And identity economics would have the idea that part of what determines my behaviors is I wish to be a certain type of person or be perceived as a certain type of person. Okay, and so that's the notion of identity. It says that the way that I make choices is not to maximize a conventional utility function, it's to adhere to an identity. And so the amusing example I will give you is that when I was a senior in high school, I wore Hawaiian shirts or cowboy shirts almost every day to school. And the reason I did that was because it was kind of saying I was cool, okay? And so I wanted to be identified as a cool teenager. And I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't be revealing this in public, but in the San Fernando Valley in the late 1970s, that's what made you cool, okay? All right, so that's a cute one. A serious one is that would be the idea that if I wish to be identified as a smart kid, I would make certain choices as to how I comport myself with respect to doing homework, so on and so forth. Okay, so all of that would require a more radical redescription of the utility function. I want to say that with reference to the model, you can still build those in, but we'd have to sort of instantiate it in a richer preference framework. Okay. So that's an entire theory, in other words, of intergenerational mobility. The key generative mechanism is that parental income is the constraining factor in education or in human capital formation. Okay. Right. So as I said, the lecture, if you go through the lecture notes, there will be a detailed description of how to translate the theoretical model into the intergenerational mobility regression. So you have a perfect relationship between theory and econometrics, but that's going to require taking stances on the nature of the technologies and the preferences. Okay, that's big theory number one. Theory number two, I'm going to call it skills, and I'm going to put the Heckman's name on it because he deserves it. All right, so the point is the following, and that is that in understanding this idea of this transmission of parents to children, the classical approach is focused on income. Income begets income. The skills approach, which Jim Heckman has pioneered with a number of co-authors, important contributors as well, is to move away from the idea that income is this sufficient statistic to actually thinking about the development of individuals across the life course. Okay. And so I mentioned just some surveys here that are of the literature, et cetera. And this work is extremely important for several reasons. One of them is, in fact, I'm going to say that the way to think about it is, I had this first model I wrote down was very compressed. It said there's one thing called childhood. There's another thing called education. And so they're scalars, they're one-dimensional. The skills literature is multidimensional. It's multidimensional in a time sense. It doesn't have a thing called childhood. It has an object called a child. A child is 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, so on and so forth. So in other words, there's a developmental trajectory. The second thing is that the child is not described by this scalar called human capital or education. Rather, the child has a set of characteristics. So what's happening is that set of characteristics is evolving across the developmental trajectory, and so that when you reach adulthood, you have a set of characteristics, and all of those characteristics are going to collectively matter for economic outcomes, and that's where the non-cognitive traits are going to come into play. Okay. So, in thinking about it this way, is the following, and this is repeating myself, is that rather than say there's this scalar called human capital, that's where the jargon skills comes from. And there are going to be these attributes that individuals have. And as I said, the one that annoys psychologists is to call something non-cognitive, but the way to think about it is human capital was the example of the cognitive skill. Okay, and so there's going to be a richer conception of cognitive skills themselves to account for different facets of cognition, but what's appended to that are personality traits. And it's the combination of the more traditional cognitive skills and personality traits that collectively determine labor market outcomes. Please.
Are non-cognitive choice variables or
I'll say neither, in the sense that you don't choose your own non-cognitive skills, but they evolve across time based on your experiences, and you can make choices that affect the non-cognitive skills. Okay, so they will be endogenous, but in a complicated way. All right. So, what are these skills? So cognitive skills are thought of as having really facets of what you might call intelligence. And intelligence itself, you want to think of as having two features. One of them is called crystal intelligence, and that's kind of the ability to draw on what you know to solve problems. And then the second is fluid intelligence, which is the ability to solve novel things where you sort of don't have the immediate background. Okay. So that's where human capital comes in. It affects these two phenomena. All right. Notice I didn't say they're exogenous. These are things that can be influenced by investments, et cetera. All right, so cognitive skills we can sort of think about as forms of intelligence, human capital. The sort of terminology you'll often see is discussion of the distinction between crystal and fluid intelligence. And that's the distinction between sort of solving problems you've seen before versus solving novel environments. Yeah. What makes this literature particularly distinct is the idea of introducing personality traits or non-cognitive skills. All right, everybody with me? So in other words, we have this child developing over childhood and adolescence as not just this enriched notion of the traditional cognitive stuff, but it's also all these personality traits. And so let me say that one of the beauties of this literature is that it is integrating psychology into economics and personality psychology. In other words, ideas from the personality psychology have been the basis and the enrichment of conventional economic models. Okay, So what are these personality traits? So again, taking a page from the psychology literature, there are 5 traits that have been identified. Okay, one of them is openness, and that captures sort of curiosity, receptivity to new situations. The second one is conscientiousness. That's being well organized, sticking to stuff. Sounds like a good graduate student characteristic. Extroversion, which is being high energy, being friendly to other people. Then there's agreeableness, which is also, again, these are not orthogonal to each other. That has sort of positive feelings towards others. And the final is neuroticism, which is the negative of self-confidence and kind of being bothered by new environments. Okay, so openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Take those 5 initials together, and they're called OCEAN. And so that's the mnemonic to keep them in mind. Now you might say, where did these categories come from? The answer is that in personality psychology literature, what have been constructed essentially are batteries of tests to ask questions to uncover personality. You take these sets of test scores, you then use factor analysis to see if there are essentially co-movements between them. Turns out that in the data sets, the literature converged on having 5 factors explaining the plethora of scores. And the 5 factors, if you look at the things they're weighting, have this ex post interpretation. Okay. There is a small literature looking at this in other contexts of other countries. And I did hear a paper a few years ago in China that claimed that for Chinese personality data, there were 7 factors. So there's nothing, this is not something that's etched in biology or anything. It merely says that you take a population of individuals, you ask questions that reveal characteristics of personality, and you statistically determine some number of factors. So that's the idea. In other words, we now have this rich conception of this thing called skills. Now, you might say, why are they called skills? Well, the trivial reason is we think the labor markets care about them. In fact, more than we think, there's incontrovertible evidence these things matter. All right, so the idea in the literature is that you now think of each individual as having this vector of cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And what you want to do, and this is really just taking notation from work by Heckman and Flavio Cunha, as you think of this vector as evolving across the life course. And so the idea would be that individuals have some set of initial conditions, call that HI. Now notice initial conditions, that doesn't mean genes. It can include genes, it's the stuff you just say at the beginning. Okay, it could be whether the family starts off in poverty or in great affluence, whatever it is. And then what happens is in every period, there's something, I'm going to call it investment, that affects the kid. So the idea is I come into this time period and I have some cognitive skills and some non-cognitive skills. If I know where I started, and I know the thing about the initial conditions of the family, and I know the experience you have, that tells me the new values of the cognitive skills, the new values of the non-cognitive skills. So there's this dynamic process by which the investments, very broadly defined, are influencing the evolution of both cognitive and non-cognitive skills. Now notice how general this formulation is. It's not just a single function that says whatever your cognitive skills are at 13, they map into, the mapping to 14 is the same as between 2 and 3. Every period of life is going to have its own transmission or relationship. So that's why the F's have these subscripts T. That's a very important thing to allow. The second thing is to notice that there's not a dichotomy that cognitive skills evolve here and non-cognitive skills evolve here. They're all interacting. After all, the evolution of the non-cognitive skill called conscientiousness affects the evolution of the cognitive skill called what you learned in school. And so naturally there's going to be interplays between those. All right? And so what the literature wants to do is to trace out these functionals, these relationships between the investments, the initial stocks, as it were, of cognitive and non-cognitive skills, and how they evolve across the life course. Now, What that does is and this is why I call it a distinct theory of intergenerational mobility, is it says what's key in intergenerational mobility is understanding how things about the parents translate into the process by which skills evolved in the developmental trajectory. All right. So I've said all of that. This is maybe the piece of algebra I want to put on the table, okay? You write down this was kind of intuitive, wasn't it? It says whatever your skills are today, they were determined by three things. What your skills were last year, what happened to you this year, kind of the initial conditions of the family, and then whatever the process is that turns those into skills. Well, if you recursively move this thing backwards, what it says is that if I look at the level of cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills for an individual today, what do they depend on? They depend on their initial conditions in the family and the sequence of experiences and things that happen to them up to this point. Again, that's very intuitive, isn't it? You today are determined by wherever you started was all the stuff that happened to you. Okay, but that's now a way of thinking. And what it does is it tells us that we want to think about the sequence of investments. Now, investments here is so broadly defined that it can be anything that happens to you. But of course, what we care about is the stuff that we can manipulate. All right, everybody comfortable with this idea that the skills I have today will be determined by the initial conditions in the family and the events that happen up to this point in time? All right. So here's an extremely important idea. And that is, okay, so I have a function, all right? I take a cross partial. What is this cross partial? It's asking the following question. I look at the effect, is everybody with me, of an investment today on my skills. How is the marginal product of my investment today affected by past skills? So in other words, I have two children. One of them has a high skill level from the past, another one has a low skill level from the past. How does that affect the value of the investment today? That's what's being calculated here. The literature assumes that the relationship is positive. And that is called a complementarity. Okay, for those of you that are mathematically oriented, complementarities in the classical sense say cross-partial derivatives are positive. A cross-partial derivative is the derivative of a derivative. What it translates to in English is it says if certain things are high, the marginal products of other things are high. And so what's key here is that there's a dynamic complementarity. What it says is if I invest in the past and raise your skill level, that'll make today's investments more productive. So in this model, skills beget skills. Investments are dynamically complements. In other words, if I invest in early childhood, it makes my later investments more valuable, productive than others. Okay. And so, again, the notes give you what the algebra is, but I want you to see the idea. The idea is we don't think of the marginal product of these investments in children in isolation. They are interacting, but they interact in a particular way. What complementarity says is that if you want high school investments to be efficacious, you better have made investments earlier on. Please.
This is extremely relevant in my country where college is actually extremely subsidized. However, it's not the same for elementary school, for kindergarten and for primary or secondary school. So the kids that actually go to college are the ones that receive the investment, so they are higher, middle or higher income than the ones that you are supposed to help with educational process.
I think that that's a key message here, is about why early childhood investment is so important and it has such a high rate of return. Where we left off was putting on the table this fundamental idea in the new literature on skills, which is dynamic complementarity, whose idea, as opposed to algebra, is that there's this interaction between the productivity of investments and what went on before. And so it was just pointed out that the efficacy of investments in college depends on what happened earlier in life. And so going back to the algebra that I've worked in, what that does is it gives this big idea, which is that if I think about an individual skill level as determined by the initial conditions and the sequence of things that have happened, then higher investments, more productive, early in life, have the consequence they make later life investments more productive. Now, to be clear, this is not a statement that kids are trapped if you don't have certain experiences in early life, and it doesn't matter what happens afterwards. It's a different statement, which is that the ability to improve outcomes is inhibited by whatever history is. So that's the first big idea there. The second big idea is that there are critical periods of development. Okay, what that means is that if we look at certain aspects of individual development, that at some ages, investments are extremely productive. In other words, the change in the level of skills is very high. That's what the double inequality means. But in other periods, are pretty small. And so this gives the second message about the timing matters thing. So the first idea for timing matters is that because of the dynamic complementarities, there's interactions as to what you do here versus the future. The second, however, is a recognition that sometimes things are very productive, sometimes less so. So everybody in this room is aware of an example of sensitive dependence, and that's language acquisition. After human beings go through puberty, the capacity to learn language goes down. In other words, there's actually physical changes in the brain that lock in whatever you've learned up to that point. And so the reason I put that on the table is that this idea of periods of both the dynamic complementarity and the sense of dependence, there's neuroscience that's associated with it. In other words, there are very good reasons to think that these types of phenomena, which are measured empirically on the social science side, in fact have at least partially biological explanations. Okay. And so maybe the conventional wisdom I would put on the table is that is the following. Okay, so this is kind of the differences with respect to the first model I gave you. These are much richer sets of mechanisms. The life cycle, the development trajectory is explicit, and there's lots of interactions that are interesting there. Okay. Now, where the literature lives is, just to give you a couple of examples, these are really from Heckman's research. One of them is the recognition that intense early childhood investments can have very persistent effects. And so this is the Heckman research that's focused on the peri-preschool interventions. And so 50 years ago, a group of disadvantaged African-American boys it was an experiment run by the government to give them very enriched early childhood investment in a place called Ypsilanti, Michigan. And these kids and now adults were traced across time. And what the Heckman research has established is that these early interventions around age 3 to 5 have had very persistent effects on adult outcomes. So you can actually see the footprints of the interventions 50 years later in terms of better labor market outcomes, more stable family relations, so on and so forth. So very powerful evidence there. Okay. The interpretation of much of this type of work is that cognitive skills seem to be very particularly sensitive to what happens in the first 3 years. Non-cognitive skills very sensitive to the next period, let's say 3 to 7, just to be concrete. And that's explaining part of what's going on in terms of the dynamics of the persistence of these interventions with children. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to say about the skills approach. The third approach I wanted to put on the table, I'm going to call neighborhoods models. Given the time, I'm not sure I'm getting to the second lecture. So let me tell you what a neighborhoods model does. Okay. So the idea of a neighborhoods model, okay, is everybody with me? We have two theories now about inequality and persistence. One of them would be focusing on parental income, transmits into human capital, transits into offspring income. The second idea would be parental skills and parental trajectories map into the evolution of skills, which map into the evolution of socioeconomic outcomes. A third perspective, and I'm going to say, I don't even like the term neighborhoods models. I want to call it a social perspective. Okay. A social perspective would say the following, and that is that if I want to understand why there's a relationship between the status of a parent and the status of a child, I need to understand the social relationships. So one example, this is something I personally worked on, are neighborhoods models. So here would be the way to think about a neighborhoods model. Okay. You have a set of parents. Everybody with me? They have incomes, just like the first models I've talked about. But what parents do in a social, when we think about neighborhoods, is they don't hire tutors for their children. They don't directly invest in human capital. What parents do is they make constrained choices as to where their children grow up. So in other words, what's essential in my income is not that I went to the human capital store and bought a piece of human capital and gave it to my child. It's that with my income, I purchased a membership in a neighborhood. And what did that neighborhood give me? Or give my children? It gave them three things, well, many things. It gave them peers. It gave them role models. And it gives them a school. All right? And so now we can think about why education as a social process is a mechanism for intergenerational mobility or intergenerational persistence. Okay. One reason would be political economy. As many of you know, much of the financing of public education in the United States between kindergarten, age 5, and senior year of high school, age 17, plus whatever the variations are across people, is determined at the school district level. It's locally determined. And so what that means is that more affluent school districts maybe will spend more per student. And so if you look across the United States, there's substantial heterogeneity in per pupil expenditures. So the political economy of education in America means that my neighbors matter. It matters what group I'm in. Everybody with me? Now, in saying that, of course, much revenue is generated at the state and federal level, so it isn't entirely controlled by localities, but even when you account for those, there is still substantial disparity. So one reason why the membership, the location would matter, which is a question you asked, would be that the political economy matters for the production of a public good called education. Okay. The second and so this is what I want us to think about neighborhoods in the following way, and that is that we would have the political economy. And the second thing, which I'm going to call social interactions. In other words, where the person grows up, there's a set of social interactions which have first-order influences on eventual success. All right. There's many ways to think about social interactions. I gave you two examples when I referred to peers and role models. And so a question was asked about endogenous preferences. Very difficult issue. But part of how you would think about identity and endogenous preferences, they're going to have to do with the social milieu in which a person develops. Here's a completely different example. There is very powerful evidence, unsurprisingly, that exposure to violence is incredibly harmful to children. Okay, the stress associated with being in a high crime neighborhood will be very deleterious to the educational process. So now think about what that would imply. Everybody with me? It would imply that if disadvantaged parents end up in neighborhoods with high crime rates and their children are exposed to gunfire violence and things, that will have an enormously, very powerful and adverse effect on educational outcomes. I'm going to call that a social interaction effect. Okay. So social interaction effects are going to be just all over the place. In other words, whenever we think about individuals to be crude as social beings, in other words, influenced by who they interact with, we're going to have a different perspective on intergenerational mobility. So the first perspectives were really family specific. The family does something directly influencing the children. And any model of intergenerational mobility would be crazy if it didn't talk about those things. Okay. At the same time, there's another dimension in which family indirectly transmits, and that's via family characteristics, determines social environment, and the social environment then influences children. Okay. And so, in thinking that through, one can develop a social perspective on intergenerational mobility, which I have in my own writings called the memberships theory of inequality. So what do I mean by the memberships theory? Well, it has three ideas in it. The first idea is that preferences, constraints, and beliefs are socially determined, partially socially determined. Okay. So you asked the question about endogenous preferences. I promise you that it mattered to my kids. They grew up in a world in which all the parents were college professors. That meant that going to college was not a choice. There was a certain norm that was established. I'm sorry, you had a question? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so what I'm saying, so if you think about what when economists theorize, I'd say that it's kind of irreducible micro-logic as we think of outcomes as determined by the interplay of, at an individual level, of preferences, constraints, and beliefs. All right. There's no content to that. In other words, unless I tell you what the preferences and constraints and beliefs are, it doesn't restrict anything. That, what makes the theories meaningful is how we instantiate them. But what I want to put on the table is that we often think about these as having social components. Okay. Furthermore, we often think of these social components as exhibiting complementarity. What does that mean? It means, for example, that if other people do something, I'm more inclined to do it. In other words, that there's reasons why behaviors become correlated in groups. And the nature of social interactions induces some co-movement across individuals. All right? The second idea would be that some memberships are endogenous. Okay. The first idea that people are socially connected in ways that induce positive co-movement. You behave similarly to your friends, role models in a community, create gravitational points, as it were, so on and so forth. Those become theories of group-level inequality. Why would we see groups are different? And obviously, discrimination is another example of a group-level influence. If you're a member of this group, it affects the constraints you face. Okay, so one aspect of social theories of intergenerational mobility and inequality would ask, why is it that group memberships are important? Okay? And the way they're going to be important tautologically is the way they influence the constraints a person faces, the preferences that they have, the way they think about the world. The second idea would be that many memberships are endogenous. That's just a fancy way of saying that if I think about who lives in what neighborhood, who attends what school or college, who works for what firm, that's part of the story of inequality, is understanding the processes by which those things are determined. But what's essential here is that these produce segregation. Okay, so you see, does everyone see that this is the template I want to have for thinking about social perspective and intergenerational mobility? One of them is there were all these group level and social structures matter. Some of the social structures you could say are ex ante. That's how you would say conditional on gender and ethnicity. These are things that you experience or things that happen to you, the way the world works. Other types of memberships are going to be things such as residential neighborhood, the school you go to, so on and so forth. Okay, but all of them collectively are influencing preferences, constraints, and beliefs. The second point to put on the table is certain dimensions of memberships are endogenous. In other words, residential neighborhoods, that's an outcome, an equilibrium outcome. Same thing with schools, so on and so forth. And what happens, therefore, if you think about the first one says these stuff matters, the second one says because these things matter, people tend to segregate themselves. All right. Now, some forms of segregation are, I'm going to say, very purposeful and malign. Others are not necessarily malign. So what do I mean by that? There are incentives, for example, for families to prefer to have affluent neighbors. Why? Because they'll pay more taxes. And so those types of preferences can induce income segregation across neighborhoods. And you will not be shocked, of course, there's very substantial income segregation in the United States. A different type of segregation is racial. In other words, you cannot explain the degrees of racial segregation in the United States based on income segregation. Because if we had two groups with different incomes and you segregate by income by implication, that would induce some segregation by race empirically, but the levels of segregation in the US are not credibly explained by that. So a second thing is there are sometimes, and this is what I call the malign preferences, is some preferences for which are discriminatory would induce racial segregation. Now, I probably shouldn't be making normative judgments, but I want to distinguish the two where there is something about a group where there's antipathy versus the case where there's not. Right. But what I want to put on the table is idea number one is social stuff matters. Idea number two is because social stuff matters, that can create segregation. Now put those ideas together. If you put 1 and 2 together, that will induce immobility. Okay, so why do I say that? If social things matter, and there's mechanisms or there are forces that lead to segregation, that means children experience different socioeconomic environments, and that will translate the socioeconomic status of the parents to the children. Please.
I can think of at least two levels of extreme complexity that this has. The first one is, for example, the apartheid was based on forcing people to remain in neighborhoods with their own ethnicity. And one of the great complaints that there was about it is that forced immobility. And the second is that when you try to the schools, the case of Native Americans here in the U.S. and border schools, where they took the children to white neighborhoods to try to adapt them to a new culture, and that was considered, well, extremely invasive. So there are too many levels of complexity. How do you take that as to make policy?
All right, so let me just step, is everyone sort of with me? Let me make sure what I call the memberships theory, the ideas are there. Social stuff influences preferences, constraints, beliefs. 2, because of those influences, there are forces that can lead to segregated groups. And once you put those together, you get persistent inequality. The question you put on the table is, how would we think about policy here? Okay, I'm going to get to that at the end of the lecture. And the answer is that I will identify some policies, and then we can talk about whether, you'll see whether qualitatively different than the example you gave. Okay, all right, is everybody comfortable with that? So that's an entire perspective on thinking about intergenerational mobility, where the carriers of the status from parents to kids are via the social things that happen, as opposed to the within family things that happen. All right, so explanation. So that puts us on the table now our third category of explanation, please.
I'm a bit confused with this. So by segregation, you mean geographic segregation, or like sort of two groups of social networks you choose one versus?
Of course, my answer is all of the above. So another one would be geographic. In other words, residential neighborhoods are segregated. Okay, school districts exhibit certain degrees of segregation. Superimposed on that would be the segregation of schools. So in other words, who attends what school within geography exhibits different types of socioeconomic, and that includes ethnic segregation. A third example, if I wanted this to be a really vast theory, would of course be colleges. Now there's a different type of segregation. And then the fourth one, if I really wanted to be a big theory, I would talk about firms. And if I wanted it to be a super big theory, I would think about segregation of partners. After all, the first unit, so if you think about a child, the first group they're a member of is called the family. And so I'd want a theory of who marries who. Then I need a theory of who lives where. Then I need a theory of who goes to school where. And then I need to know who goes to college where, and then where do you work. So you see at each level, I could interpret these inequality dynamics via this process of either segregation or integration. Okay, so I want to put that on as kind of a big picture thing, and as I said, given my mishandling of time, I'm not sure I'm going to get to the second set of slides, so I want the ideas on the table. Okay. So, 2 family investment theories, 1 social theory, and then the final thing I'm going to put on the table is not going to be very satisfactory, which I need to say something about genetics. So what do I mean about genetics? This is a very strange area right now in social science. And what I mean, strange is not an exciting area. It's a frontiersy area, but its interpretation is complicated. I mean, at one level, if I said, do you think that genes matter? Of course, everyone say genes matter, okay? As I said, if I said that there's a correlation in skill at the violin between parents and children, we would not say it's entirely, we wouldn't think it's entirely because violinists force their kids to learn to play the violin. We think, there are certain abilities that we think get passed on. Those types of intuitions are fine. What is lacking at this point is serious empirical work on the role of genes. I mean, there are papers that have tried to do that, but it's actually very difficult to identify in a quantitative sense to what extent the correlations between parents and children are simply reflective of the fact that parents pass on their genes to kids. And so what I want to do is just to give you a little bit of a sense of how the literature in social science works on questions of genes and outcomes, and to recognize that this is, very unresolved territory. Okay. So let me in saying that, I need to make 2 caveats. First of all, when people talk about genes, there's a couple of mistakes that are often made. The first one is that sometimes people think if I say somebody has a genetic basis, that means it can't be dealt with. Okay, so in other words, sometimes you'll see discussion that makes claims of the form, well, if there's a genetic reason why there's inequality, cannot be resolved. Okay, that's nonsense. And Arthur Goldberger gave the famous example. You see these? Okay. Heterogeneity, inequality in eyesight is almost entirely genetic. I mean, there's some issues with nutrition, but conditional on basic minimum nutritional standards, it's all genes. It's also very easily corrected. Okay, so the first point is there is no map relationship between the efficacy of public policy and this particular explanation. The second comment is that this has nothing I say has to do with group level inequality. This is about individuals, not groups. Okay. The fact that there could be heterogeneity, that there's some passing on of things from parents to child entails nothing about how aggregates differ.
When you're talking about genetics, are you talking about the passing on of genes that are coded in DNA, or are you also talking about epigenetic factors?
I need to get to that. Okay. So here's some jargon that everybody should have. Okay, so if I refer to your DNA, that's called your genotype. So 23andMe, that's what they sequence. All right. There's, I believe, about 30 million single nucleotide polymorphisms called SNPs. If you look at the DNA, this is where you have the base pairs. And there's only a few 100,000 where human beings differ from one another. So that you keep in mind, and most of them we don't. And so when DNA is sequenced, it's somewhere between 200,000 and 600,000 locations of differentiation are shown. Okay? So the genotypes, think of that as the DNA. The phenotype is the person. Okay, everybody with me? And then the third thing is the difference between genetics and epigenetics. Okay. But one way to think about the DNA is the following, which is you have a genotype. That's like a blueprint. So a baby's conceived, there's a genotype, that's the blueprint, and a baby is produced. That's the wrong way to think. In other words, the right way to think is that what the genotype is, it's a set of blueprints. Everybody with me? And based on the experience in utero, certain genetic triggers go on or off, and that produces the baby. What epigenetics, much of its focus is on, is how in utero development determines the genetic triggers. All right, so everybody with me in jargon? Genotype, phenotype, epigenetics. Why did I make the last one a big deal? Because lots of discussion tends to say it's nature or nurture, genes or the environment. That's not a good way to think. Genes and the environment interact in very complicated ways and produce these things called us and produce outcomes. Okay. So, the way that evidence has been put on the table for the role of genes comes in kind of, I'll say there's a classical way to say genes matter, and then there's the 21st century way to say genes matter. The classical way to understand the role of genes is to use what are called kinship studies. Okay, a kinship study basically has the following idea. I could look at how similar people are in their outcomes as compared to what their genetic overlap is. And so the most famous example of that is looking at twins. So you see are identical twins more similar than fraternal twins? Because in one case, they have 100% overlap. Second case, 50% overlap. So that would be used to measure some idea that would tell you something about genes. Okay. Other studies would compare whether or not adoptive children or birth children are more similar to their parents, to the parents that raised them. That's the same principle. In other words, the idea would be that you think about the interplay of genetic overlap and family exposures, and you somehow use that to uncover the role of genes. Okay? Those are all perfectly sensible intuitions. All right. What I call the 21st century approach is to actually use genotypic data. That's what I meant, genomic data. You sequence the DNA, and you can identify individual genetic markers or sets of genetic markers that are predictive of socioeconomic outcomes. Okay, and what is referred to as genoeconomics is a literature that's emerged, and it really is emerging in social science, where data sets now exist which have sequenced DNA, and and there are procedures for I'll say, correlating or identifying statistical relationships between genetic markers and outcomes of interest. Okay. So that sits here, that sits here. Within the genetics literature, there's something called the heritability paradox. So again, another thing to be aware of. What that refers to is that if you look in the kinship data, the role of genes as measured is qualitatively higher than in the genomic literature. Now, and what I mean by that is that the explanatory power of sets of genes for things in many cases seems to be low compared to what's implied by the kinship literature. And there's different ways to think about that. But right now the literatures are kind of like this. Okay. You have undoubtedly read examples of successes in genomics, such as identifying the specific genetic marker for something such as Huntington's disease. Okay, those are cases in which the phenomena of interest is simple. In other words, there's one location, and if it has one value, you get this, one value, you get that. We're not interested necessarily in simple stuff, are we? If I want to know about the relationship between genes and education, that's a complicated thing. And that's where the heritability paradox seems to be important. Okay, and I know obviously oversimplifying stuff in the literature, but these are just some ideas to have in your head. So what I wanted to acquaint you with now was just kind of, what's hard about this stuff. And I want you to see it through the context of twin studies, because that sounds like the smoking gun. Isn't that incredible? If I make the observation that identical twins are much more similar than fraternal twins. Even cooler, what if I had separated identical twins and they're really similar, but then I have raised together dizygotic twins and they're not all that similar. All that sounds like the ways that you would come up with a statement that genes really matter. What I want to persuade you of is there's less there than meets the eye. And so, in other words, when I said this is not going to be a satisfactory discussion, I want you to see how hard it is to identify stuff. Okay, everybody with me on that? All right, so the way that the classical literature on genes works is that you have some outcomes such as omega, whatever it is you care about, you call it IQ, wages. If I was going to, Arthur Goldberger here, would say speaking French. Whatever the outcome is, you would say that there's a genetic component A, a shared environmental component C, and a non-shared environmental component called E. So the idea in the literature is to say that the thing you're interested in is the sum of effects from all three. Okay? Now, what's it mean to say the environment is shared versus non-shared? That's what is meant by family. The assumption in the literature is that if you were raised in the same family as somebody else, you share the environment. That's it. And so this is how the literature works. It basically says there are these outcomes we care about. We want to say one part's due to genes, one part's due to the family, one part's due to everything else. That's luck, and non-shared environment. We want to parse out how important they are. So, what the literature then does is it assumes that genes, environment are uncorrelated. And that's where you get this idea that I would say, I look at wages and 50% of wage variation is due to genes and 50% is the environment. To say that is this, how do I say the variance of something is the variance of this plus the variance of this? That means they're uncorrelated. And so in other words, what the literature assumes, the classical literature, I don't want, there's stuff on the frontier that's different, but the classical literature actually assumes that genes and the environment are uncorrelated. And so what happens is the variance of the outcome is the variance of genes across people, its contribution, plus the variance of families across people, plus the variance of luck across people. But to even say that is to assume that the stuff's uncorrelated. All right. So the way that the classical calculations work is they would say what you can do is you can sort of say what's the variance of the outcome for a person. It's going to be the variance of the a squared plus c squared plus e squared. That's the contributions of the three pieces. Then if I ask what's the covariance of monozygotic twins, it's the variation of the genes plus the variation of the environment, because they share both of them 100%. What's the variation of dizygotic twins? Well, they share the environment, so the c squared's there, but only half of the a squared, because they only share half their genes. And we love those equations, don't we? Because I count 3 equations and 3 unknowns, so you can solve for it. Okay. So so again, that would be the baseline for how somebody said, or a paper says 50% of something's genes, so on and so forth. Please. Yeah.
If there are identical twins, then the appearances are identical, it doesn't mean the appearance exactly.
All right, so that's a second order. In other words, to say they're identical, is it literally identical, or it's identical plus or minus epsilon, it's the second. So in other words, in the calculation, that would not have a material effect. Okay, and so there's a few behavioral geneticists that have tried to introduce some more heterogeneity from the twin variation that I'll ask you to trust is it's theoretically correct, but it's second order. All right, that's exactly how that's the classical literature. And notice that it does exactly what I said, it formalizes the intuition. If identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins, then we say that's evidence that genes matter. Okay. My question to you is this a believable exercise? And this is my late former colleague, Arthur Goldberger, my colleague when I was at Wisconsin, spent the last 20 years of his life debunking twin studies. Okay. Now, what is it I want to say to you? What I want to say is, and this is the issue of social science. I gave you something, I had a powerful intuition. That was that somehow similarity of different types of twins would reveal the role of genes. And then I had a statistical model. And the statistical model said, well, all this stuff's uncorrelated, and so that'll give me variance decompositions. What Goldberger's research work comes down to is he argued that 2 of the assumptions were bad assumptions. The first assumption is that genes and the environment are uncorrelated. If you remember the model that I wrote down for intergenerational mobility, the family model, it had quite the opposite, didn't it? In that model, genes affected the environment. Okay, so the first problem in the model that was used, the classical model, is that it did not appropriately address the fact that parents create an environment for their children, and they will know something about their genotype. Now, the issue is not whether they know it, it's whether they know something, and that would break the correlation, the uncorrelatedness assumption. So that's the first point. Everybody with me? And the second point is the assumption of the model said the following. It said that if we're identical twins, we experience the same environment as if, even whether we're identical or fraternal. And so what that means is that it assumes that parents raise dizygotic twins equally similarly than monozygotic twins. Okay, and there's different levels at which you could question that assumption. One of them is that if I tailor my family environment for the genotype of a child, by definition, I will, by implication, I will have a more correlated environment for monozygotic twins than dizygotic twins. Okay? And the second thing is I may have some utility that I care whether they're monozygotic or dizygotic. So Goldberger liked to tell these stories about how people like to dress identical twins the same way. I mean, that's anecdotal, but you could see there may even be a preference issue. All right, so what I want to say is the following. Okay, and that is if you wrote out all of these equations, and I allowed for 2 things. I allowed genes in the environment to covary, and I allowed parents to raise monozygotic twins differently from dizygotic twins. If you go through the same exercise, well, I have some bad news for you. I now have 4 equations and 8 unknowns. There's no solution. Okay, that's the Goldberger critique. For our purposes, I want to say 2 things. First of all, I want you to see why the critique works. I don't care about the algebra is fine. You can read the lecture notes for that. The idea. And that is to uncover a distinct role for genes required strong behavioral assumptions. Now, an answer you could give me is maybe you should look at more than twins data. Some of the work in the behavioral genetics literature looks at the children of twins. Are the children of twins more correlated than the children of other types? Okay. I could, in principle, even though unfortunately genetic overlap decays quickly, I could look at first cousins, so on and so forth. What I want to put on the table is a theorem that's, which is not published, but it's true. The theorem is true, and it's due to myself and two co-authors, Andros Cortelles and Qiming Tang. And what we show is the following. Any set of kinship relationships that you give me, it doesn't matter if I'm looking at twins, I'm looking at cousins, I'm looking at siblings, I'm looking at children of twins. You give me k different kinship types. You can never identify the role of genes unless you make additional assumptions. In other words, you restrict the covariance of how genes in the environment move together across the kinship types. So in other words, there's no way you can move beyond these assumptions that were arbitrarily imposed in the kinship studies. All right, so I put all that on the table because I wanted to disabuse you, as it were, of an idea that kinship studies are dispositive of the role of genes. Now, should that make you an atheist? No. What it should say is that you need to consider two things. One, how can you use behaviorally sensible assumptions and impose them on kinship data in order to make credible arguments about the role of genes or the environment? Or the second is to take the genomic approach. And so the genomic approach would be to actually look at genes, would be actually to look at the genome. All right, so what I want to do is just finish up this discussion by saying that part of what is in the literature, which is going to be essential in actually making genetics useful and talking about intergenerational mobility, is epigenetics. So is everybody with me? Where I wanted to bring you was the twin studies is where most of the evidence comes from. There's some deep reasons why one can be skeptical about the twin studies. They don't seem to properly account for the way that the environment is shaped or influenced by the genotype of a child. Now, and there's no way to simply say, I don't take a stance in how the genotype affects the environment and still identify the role for genes. That was the impossibility theorem. I want to say separately, there is work now on looking at the correlations of certain genetic markers with socioeconomic outcomes. There is no work at this point that links that to intergenerational mobility, because there are no data sets, to be blunt, where you have the genotypes of the parents and the offspring, and you could link those up and then translate those into the mobility. Okay? That's just, the data aren't there. But the final thing I want to emphasize is that where the literature is, and this is the 21st century mobility issue, is to get away from this thinking genes versus the environment and to focus on so-called epigenetics, which is the complex developmental interplay of genes in the environment. So, well, the reason I spend time on this place where I can't say that there's any evidence, right? You know, again, there's studies that have made arguments about, let's say, adoptees versus birth children and the like, that these identification problems have not been satisfactorily resolved. But nevertheless, with the emergence of genomic data, it is likely, I think, that eventually these types of measurements will be possible. Please. Ooh, that's almost a philosophical question. In fact, it is. Okay, so you have the markers are simply the number of counting the alleles. In other words, you have zero. You look at the alleles, and there's certain values there. Okay. Your question is, what would it? Suppose that I did the following. Okay. And that is that I have a study that has measures of IQ. I go through an algorithm that finds that there are some locations in the DNA whose values are correlated with IQ. Okay, this has been done. You want to know what the interpretation is of that finding. Everybody with me? Well, the answer is, the interpretation is, these are correlated with IQ. What is not, and this is where the frontier is to go beyond that. Okay, so what do I mean? So one issue, and this is where I'd say the best research of this type does, is it then looks at the genetic markers and sees what do we know about the biological pathways. So if I found a genetic marker is correlated with IQ, but the only thing it predicts is how long one's little toe is, we would think differently than if it's a genetic marker that we know the biological pathways that affects something in neurons. Okay, so right now that's part of what the literature is trying to grapple with, is the identification of the biological pathways that the statistical algorithms are linking to things. Okay, and I think so that's answer number one. Answer number two is that when you said what is consciousness or what is intelligence, these are pretty complicated phenomena, and this goes back to a limitation of the literature. And that is there are actually computational limits on identifying correlations between SNPs and socioeconomic outcomes. What do I mean by that? Is the algorithms are not able to basically look at all possible combinations of SNPs. So the first generation, what are called GWAS studies, roughly speaking, would run 600,000 regressions of one genetic marker against an outcome. You then see which ones are statistically significant, accounting for the fact you ran 600,000 tests, and those would be the ones you identify. Okay, now the literature's gone beyond that. But what I want to say is that the literature is not in a good position to deal with something, it's called epistasis, which are gene-gene interactions. And so you might think, there may be good reasons to think intelligence is an emergent property of many genes interacting, and the literature is not there to talk about it yet. Okay, questions on any of that? All right, so where are we? We have, as I said, we have on the table the family investment models. The literature is very rich in terms of empirical evidence on how family income matters. We have the skill models, that's the frontier in terms of understanding the evolution of skills and the role of the family. We have social models, which are somewhat more difficult to identify. I like to say the evidence is not nearly as strong as the family models, but there I think are compelling reasons. I could carry out the affirmative evidentiary case that they matter. And then there's the mysterious one, which are is genes, where, as I said, no serious person would deny that the genotype matters. We just don't have good ways to quantify it with reference to things such as the correlation of parent and offspring income. That requires too much relative to what's currently known. So what to make of it? Actually, I'm sorry, this is actually worth knowing. I want to give you an example of famous evidence on epigenetics. It has to do with what's called the Dutch winter famine of 1945. So in the Netherlands, at the end of the Second World War, there was a famine. All right, and so what happened, medical scientists studied women that were pregnant during this famine in the Netherlands. Everybody with me? And what was discovered is that if you looked at the children who were in utero during the famine, in a particular trimester, if they were in utero, they were likely to be overweight as adults. So the question is why? It's an observation. Well, there's two explanations. You would think of one of them is maybe people who are pregnant during famines raise their kids differently. It's perfectly sensible. I'm going to ask that we put it there, because the explanation that has been developed here is to make the following argument. And that is, and this is what I meant about the genetic triggers. And what's happened was, as the fetuses were developing, the genetic triggers were turned on to crave calories. So the idea is the mother's experiencing calorie deprivation. What is the evolutionarily adaptive response? Produce children that really crave calories. That would make, okay, I'm saying adaptive sense because in the time where the adaptation occurs in a period where what caused famines was weather, and therefore it was it meant the expected value as a child would be in a calorie-deprived environment, and craving calories is healthy. But thanks to modern civilization, we can create high-frequency famines, and so this was not adaptive today, because it meant that the children came into a world where there was no calorie deprivation. So having a sweet tooth, or whatever you want to call it, was maladaptive and produced obesity. So that's I said, it's a classic example of what epigenetics would mean, which is the genetic triggers in utero produce characteristics in the adults that affected behaviors. Okay. And so that's why this is so, even though the evidence on humans is very indirect like this is why it's often mentioned. Okay. All right. So what I wanted to finish with was some discussion of distributive justice. Okay, so what we put on the table, everybody with me, is that we think about kind of facts, ways to measure mobility, and there the emphasis was on the two measures. I spent most of the time on the IgE. We want to notice its limitation is it's a linear measure, and so I think part of the interesting action in measurement has to do with nonlinear models that allow for different sensitivities of the parents. I gave relatively little attention to relative mobility. That's the ranks literature, and I probably should have given more to it because there's certain virtues to it, both normatively and positively. I put on the table 4 theories, 3 of which I think there's good evidence, 1 of which we have good intuition but no way to quantify. And then if I don't want to ask, and this is the question you asked, what about policy? This is your policy question. Okay, so I guess there's a couple of things I want to say. The first is that in thinking about policy and inequality, a natural division is between normative arguments, ethical arguments that focus on equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunity. So if I wanted to make an argument in favor of equality of outcomes, the way I would make that is often I make that as a utilitarian or a welfarist. What I would say is you redistribute income, and your marginal utility to your $7 millionth dollar is lower than my marginal utility to my 100,000. So if we redistribute, I'm going to raise average utility. So put differently, many of the justifications for equality of outcome equalization, they often emerge from environments in which we talk about some notion of welfarism. That my objective as the policymaker is that I want to maximize a social welfare function, maybe average well-being of individuals, so on and so forth. A conceptually different idea is that we think about ameliorating inequality because it is unfair. That's the so-called deontological approach. In other words, there are certain rules about what's right and wrong, what's fair and unfair, and we would like society to act in a way that addresses those. What that approach naturally leads to is changing the orientation from equality of outcomes towards equality of opportunity. Okay, that's a nice buzz phrase we hear all the time in politics. We say, we want equality of opportunity. Okay. The underlying idea, however, there's a meaningful distinction there. And one of the ways that you end up with the distinctions emerging in a philosophical sense is whether we're thinking about welfarist considerations versus what I call fairness considerations. Now, to be clear, I think it's silly to think of these as competing. All right. In other words, they have different implications, so we may come to disagreements. But if I said to you I'm very motivated by deontological considerations, does that mean I don't care about welfarist considerations? All right. So to make this all concrete, who likes to gamble? Him. All right. So if he and I go to a casino, everybody with me? And I win $100 at blackjack and he loses $100, there's not really much of an argument that I should give him my 100, is there? Apparently nobody agreed with me. They like you better than me. All right, the serious point is that the example I gave of inequality, what's important about the example? It said that we both made a choice to engage in the gambling, and this is what John Romer would say is an example where I am responsible for the inequality and you are responsible for the inequality. Please.
But the problem is that risk preferences are also circumstance dependent. So some part of you say I'm more likely to gamble or I'm more willing to gamble are also influenced by things which are beyond my control.
Okay. So no, I want to distinguish. So Romer does have an answer to that. So let me see if I'll give the defense. So the key idea, in other words, in the equality of opportunity, where the philosophical literature, and this is really, you know, an economist, Romer is I think it's fair to say, has been the most influential figure, is to start off with the argument that inequalities are not justified when we do not hold individuals responsible for them. If you asked Romer who decides what we're responsible for, he has a different answer. He would say that that's what the political process does. In other words, that's what the nature of politics is. There's not an answer as to what extent what it is we hold people responsible for or not. But that's distinct from saying conditional and knowing what you're responsible for. That would become the division for how we think about where the government, or where we would like policy to intervene or not. Okay, so that would be Romer's answer. I think I would give a slight, does everybody understand the answer, the objection, and what is a possible answer? I think the second answer, I would give a different answer, because I agree with you, but that means that, actually maybe Romer would give this answer too. There'll be areas where we disagree, and there's areas where society can come to an agreement. Okay, so let me see if I can make that not a cheat. Consider the example about the casino. Okay, the answer on responsibility is he was born with the gambling gene. It's not his fault. Okay. I want to distinguish that from the case which I've been talking about, which is I'm born into a poor family. I am raised in a poor neighborhood. Okay. The debate about responsibility, the complex gray area is where? It's on the gambling part. The easy part's the second one, isn't it? So in other words, the way that we proceed with Romer is not to dismiss your objection, but then to ask a different question, which is where can we come up with something that's closer to a consensus in terms of drawing the responsibility line. Okay, but what you brought up is an issue with the theory, and in fact, if I get to it, it's an issue with how even though he doesn't think it does impact his theory substantively. Okay, so that's what I want to put on the table as something to think about. And the way that we might think about Romer's theory, so here's some more algebras. I have some outcomes omega. Everybody with me? And what we'd want to say is I can observe, there's inequalities across people, and there's stuff I don't observe. And so what I want to say is that the X's you're responsible for and the Z's you're not responsible for. I'm sorry, and so the idea would be that we have an equality of opportunity if conditional on the stuff we're responsible for, that's sufficient to explain inequality. Okay, so you see that would be a way of thinking about how we would operationalize equality of opportunity. So the idea would be that I have outcomes of individuals, and I would identify the stuff I think they're responsible for, or the stuff I don't think they're responsible for. And so conditional on the stuff we're going to make you responsible for, the other stuff shouldn't be predictive. And so what I was arguing relative to you is that the way the argument we would proceed is you and I would agree that you're not responsible for who your parents are. We would have a debate about whether a 20-something is responsible for his love of playing blackjack. Now, to be clear, I should say Romer doesn't like my formulation of his work, but that's fine. I'm giving the lecture, not him. All right. I'm going to say several things. First of all, the fact that that's the definition of equality of opportunity does not mean it's feasible. Okay, that's point number one. It may not be possible to do that because that's going to depend on the structure of society. The second comment is that it may be the case there's reasons you don't want to do it, even though equality of opportunity is by itself a virtue. The two reasons you wouldn't want to do it are one, incentive effects, and related. One direction you would go is there, and the other is there may be other ethical considerations. Okay, but at least what I wanted to put on the table is a way to think about the normative implications of different mobility models. Is the question as to what extent to which they represent mechanisms that we wish to hold people, we think society ought to hold people responsible. And in fact, that's one of the things about the genetic business is that we often think of that's who the person is, and so that we treat that differently often. And not say it's defensible. John Rawls would say it's actually not defensible. We think of that differently than we do things such as family environment. Okay, so I want this just on a table, a way to think about the ethics of inequality. Okay. So here's a couple of problems with the definitions. Okay, is everybody with me? This is just a way to think about, if you study intergenerational mobility, one of the things you want to focus on is what are the implications of the mechanisms for whether we hold people responsible for them. I guess what I wanted to say is that one limit to this approach is it assumes that you're not responsible for that you are responsible for epsilon. Okay, and this is an important thing to think about. I want to go back to your example. Okay, so Romer has a famous example in his writings, where he asks the following question: should the government indemnify individuals for lung cancer if they smoke? And so what Romer gives is, here's a hypothetical. I look at two categories of people. I'm going to call them white female college professors and African American steel workers. Everybody with me? Male steel workers. So what Romer would say is you take the white female college professors and you look at the median level of smoking. Okay? What's the 50th percentile? And we hold people are responsible for their smoking only to the extent they deviate from the 50th percentile. Everyone with me? So what he wants to say is, if you have this particular group where smoking is really rare, then people are typically responsible for their smoking. If you take another group where smoking is more common, then you don't hold people responsible because that was something that is happening at the group level. This is his objection made very clear, which is, if I said to you that I have a group of people where virtually nobody smokes, the fact that somebody smokes doesn't suggest a weakness of will, does it? Maybe something terrible happened to them. All right, and so I give you just a little examples. That's why it's difficult in any of these formulations to come up with a concrete statement. And that you have to decide about the stuff you can't explain whether people are responsible or not. Okay, everybody with me on that? All right. Now, okay. All right, so I think, so then let me say something about capabilities. So let me first of all make some comments about so is everybody with me on where I want to be on the ethics literature? I said what's kind of the traditional stuff about thinking about equalization. One idea was welfarist. You smooth things out because it leaves people better off. Clearly that argument becomes powerful if you're thinking about the disadvantage of children, why you want basic nutrition, basic health, etc. But there's no competition with equality of opportunity. A second idea is you would like people to have access to opportunities in life. That's becomes more of a pure fairness issue. There is a third idea, and that's due to Amartya Sen. And what Amartya Sen would say is that what society should do is maximize the capabilities of individuals. So Sen's idea is the following, is he wants to say that he cares about outcomes. So he's not a deontological guy, it's not some abstract rules, he cares about consequences. So he would call himself a consequentialist. But he cares about something bigger than simply standard measures of utility or welfare. Okay, so Sen calls these capabilities. And so the way you would think about that is, in a society, we don't just care about how much income you have. We care about your capacity to read, to experience music, to practice the religious beliefs that you adhere to untrammeled, so on and so forth. All right? So what I'm trying to put on the table, in other words, is yet there's another vision of what we would mean for an equal society, which is that everybody has this large set of life courses that they can choose from. And so I'm putting all this on the table because when we think about as I said, one justification for thinking about egalitarian things has to do with, I called it standard notions of welfare utility. The second is that the rules of society be fair. The third is we engage in policies which promote equality, not because equality is the end point, but because they are enhancing to life course capabilities, and that's the Sen idea. And so what Sen would do is he really wants to have a theory of effective freedom, and so the society he's looking for has the most freedom for different individuals. All right, so I wanted to put that on the table as kind of a third way to think about the types of policies that we would want to implement. All right, and so the distinction there is that the focus, as I said, was on kind of the constraints that people face as opposed to the actual choices they make. This is very close to Heckman's work. And the reason for that is that many of the constraints people face in life can be thought of in terms of skills. In other words, if people are put in environments that don't let them cultivate the capacity for conscientiousness, that's very delimiting as to what the life courses are. And so we can think of policies that try to equalize capabilities and skills actually entail a corollary, which is this link there. All right, does that make sense? I mean, just again, another perspective in thinking about the normative sides of equality. Okay. So, that all sounds great. And so, well, it sounds great because those are obviously clear virtues there. So in other words, something about personal welfare, well-being, something about the fairness of the rules, and something about the constraint sets, the capacities of individuals. That's kind of where the action is in different aspects of egalitarian philosophy. All right. Let me just end by noting a couple of things with reference to policies. Okay. The first is the question you asked, and that is, in thinking about policies, notice that these different theories that I put on the table could entail very different types of policies. So one policy, if I was from the world of Becker and Tomes, would be to equalize per pupil expenditures, get the human capital investments to be equated. In the social world, here are the sorts of things I might want to do. I might want to change zoning rules. So in other words, many neighborhoods in the United States have a rule that says every house, every property must have a single family dwelling. Let me translate that into English, no apartments. So in other words, there are many rules that will condition the degrees of economic segregation. So that would be something you could consider. All right. And so I think that one of the messages I'd like you to get from all of this is that as we broaden the different mechanisms for understanding mobility, those will entail different types of policies. Okay. The second comment I want to make is that in thinking about these policies, of course, there's going to be other objectives here. All right, I focus, for example, on responsibility. I said that inequalities are not justified when you're not responsible for them. Well, that's true in some contexts. In other contexts, we may think that sometimes merit matters, whether you deserve something, desert. Okay, so I'm 100% certain nobody here thinks I deserve a gold medal in the Olympics. No matter how hard I tried, it's not happening, because that's a context in which there's agreed upon set of rules, and the criterion for the distribution had to do with who deserves something, not whether you're responsible for something. All right, and so, but in thinking about any policy, that's going to come into play. To give a different example, when we talk about the rules for college admissions, much of the discussion has to do with who deserves to be in a college, and so on and so forth. That means you have to take a stance on what desert means. Okay. The third thing I want to say about policy is that I've kind of emphasized this nonlinear stuff. So, well, you know, the world is really pretty nonlinear. Poverty traps, affluence traps, so on and so forth. When the world's nonlinear, you have to account for that when you do calculations of policy returns. So to say the world's nonlinear means it's very hard to extrapolate from historical policies to what new policies would do. If it turns out that raising per pupil expenditure from $10,000 per student to $15,000 has no effect, that doesn't imply raising to 30 will have no effect. It may be there's a threshold. And so the final message I wanted to give you is one of the reasons to be worried about the algebra and the formal models is the formal models give us a way of embodying these nonlinear ideas, which can be important in cost-benefit analysis. Okay, so I think that's where I want to stop. Thank you. Any final questions or food?
So my question was regarding intergenerational mobility. I mean, when we think about it, how do you really think about wages or so is it labor income or is it capital income? And how do we
Well, I think that's an excellent point. I think part of the capital income stories tends to be a bit different, and that's something I did not talk about, which is inheritance. And so in Thomas Piketty's book, he makes a very big deal about that. I think that most of the view of the rising inequality in the U.S. is about labor income, and not that. So in that sense, that's why I was not particularly motivated by it. But I think that's a perfectly legitimate. If you said, what did I leave out? Okay, that would be one of them. Second would be I'll say the entire dimension of political economy. And that is, how does the changes in inequality beget changes in policies that increase or decrease intergenerational mobility? Please.
You were giving the example of the family measurement for epigenetics, right? You can think of thousands of interesting examples or past experiments that you might want to try, but the only data set that I think that follows parents and their child is the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth.
Mm-hmm.
What other data sets are available that are interesting to explore?
Well, the panel study of income dynamics has parents and descendants. Now, some of these data sets are beginning to collect genetic data. And so the Health and Retirement Survey, I believe, is doing that. I think the NLSY is beginning to do that. But again, this is beginning to emerge. And there's also data sets in other countries which are much more systematic in this regards. Please.
Yeah, my question, so forgive it, but because you covered a lot of ground, what do you think is the most interesting next frontier as this starts to really unfold in terms of the literature?
So I think there's several. One, I think given since the nature of the available data is changing, understanding gene-environment interactions is important. So I think that is a clear frontier. I think separately that group inequality needs more of a renaissance than it's had. And what I mean by that is that much of the morally, most serious issues in American inequality, they are still cutting along the lines of race and to some extent gender. So I think all of that is enormously important. And so I think I would put those two on the table. Please.
One of the readings talked about changing focus from this 30,000-foot view of inequality, thinking about how society is structured, towards thinking about obviously the mechanism of generational transmission. Is there work that tries to link those two approaches in the sense of thinking about the implications of how society is structured for the functional form of intergenerational transmission?
I think that it does, and maybe I should, something I skipped is there's also a specific, the second lecture was about something called the Great Gatsby Curve. And so the Great Gatsby Curve is the empirical observation across the OECD. The countries that are more unequal cross-sectionally are also have less mobility. And so there are different explanations have been given for that. So I've already revealed the one I'm interested in is more inequality begets more segregation, which slows down mobility. A second reason for it would be political economy. More inequality begets policies that would slow down mobility. A third idea would be that there's something nonlinear in the family relationships, which is more inequality means more families are credit constrained, or at certain stages of life, and that slows down mobility. So I think that's a place where I would concretely identify how these broader structures are mapping into the individual outcomes.